Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, before we start, may I please have your attention for a moment? There is some practical information that everyone needs to be aware of. In the event of an evacuation, please use the emergency exit at the long side of the room, or the main exits in the back. Should an evacuation become necessary, please move outside in a calm and orderly fashion, and gather by the statue in front of the museum. Thank you for your attention.
Holberg Laureate Onora O'Neill, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends, good morning everybody, and welcome to Bergen and this typical nice Bergen weather. It is indeed a great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Holberg Symposium and the Holberg Lecture. I would like to welcome in particular the Holberg Prize Laureate, as well as the other speakers on the symposium program today. This is the second day of the Holberg Week. Yesterday, the Nils Klim Prize Laureate had a conversation with two other invited speakers on the social costs of incarceration, and the Holberg Prize Laureate met with young Nordic researchers in a masterclass conversation on judgment and interpretation. Tonight, the City Mayor of Bergen will host a reception for invited guests. Tomorrow is the day of award ceremonies for the School Prize in Bergen Cathedral School and the Nils Klim Prize, as well as the Holberg Prize, here in the University Aula. The Norwegian government will host a dinner for invited guests, and on Friday afternoon, the Holberg Prize Laureate will participate in an event in Oslo. As many of you know, the Holberg Prize was established by the Norwegian Parliament in 2003, and it is administered by the University of Bergen. The prize is dedicated to the fields of arts and humanities, social science, law, and theology. The prize is named after Ludvig Holberg, who was born in Bergen in 1684 and became a professor at the University of Copenhagen with contributions in almost all the fields which are covered by the Holberg Prize. The university has appointed a board for the prize, and the prize is awarded by the board on behalf of the University of Bergen and on the recommendation of the Holberg Prize Academic Committee, which consists of outstanding international scholars in the fields of the prize. The laureate must have had a decisive influence on international research in his or her field, for instance, through the development of new theory, knowledge, or insight, through making innovative use of existing theories, or through the methods that are applied. The laureate's contributions may be interdisciplinary or within one particular discipline. With Onora O'Neill as the winner of the 2017 prize, we can safely say that these criteria have been more than fulfilled. This symposium and the Holberg Lecture will give us a good opportunity to reflect on important topics within the laureate's scientific and scholarly work. It is an arena for discussing different perspectives and views related to these topics. Reflections and discussions are essential and necessary activities within the academic fields that are covered by the Holberg Prize. I am indeed looking forward to today's event with anticipation and excitement. Again, I welcome all of you, and I'm pleased to give the floor to the Academic Director of the Holberg Prize, Professor Ellen Mortensen, who will be the moderator of today's event. Thank you very much.
Good morning. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you all to this year's Holberg Symposium on Ethics for Communication, and a special welcome to the Holberg Laureate, Baroness O'Neill of Bengard, in whose honor the symposium is being held. We had hoped that the sun might shine on the laureate and the speakers today, and lo and behold, we have been heard. Before I proceed to introduce this year's Holberg Prize Laureate, please bear with me as I give you some practical information. Today's symposium is divided into 2 sessions. In the first session, Professor Onora O'Neill will introduce the theme of the symposium and present the 3 first speakers. After the 3 lectures and a subsequent short coffee break, the second session will start with Professor O'Neill's presentation of the final 2 speakers. Immediately after the speakers have given their talks, there will be a panel discussion moderated by myself and featuring all 5 speakers in addition to Professor O'Neill herself. The symposium will end at 1 p.m. sharp. Directly following the symposium, a complimentary lunch will be served for all of you in the aula. And after a lunch break, at 2 p.m., again sharp, Professor Onora O'Neill will give her Holberg lecture entitled Justice Without Ethics, a 20th Century Innovation. I hope that the audience will stay on for the lecture, in which the laureate will discuss the complex and changing relationship between justice and ethics over time in the West. Now, without further ado, let me introduce the 2017 Holberg laureate, Baroness O'Neill of Bengarve. Onora O'Neill is one of the most distinguished and influential philosophers of her generation. Her work on moral and political philosophy, above all, her research on Immanuel Kant, has transformed our understanding of the German philosopher and has contributed to a resurgence of interest in his work. In her early books, Acting on Principle from 1975 and Constructions of Reason from 1989, O'Neill challenges received wisdom, which argued that Kant saw reasoning as requiring that we make it possible for others to understand what we say and to grasp what we do. She has also demonstrated in works such as Faces of Hunger from 1986 and Bounds of Justice from 2000, how philosophy may provide vital insights into some of the most pressing moral issues of our time. And she has changed the understanding of the nature of our obligations in an unequal world. To quote the committee's citation, quote, while rigorously arguing for a world of porous boundaries and a more dispersed and even distribution of power, O'Neill showed how doctrines of rights and notions of obligation require us to pay attention not just to the needs of strangers, but to the structural conditions of oppression that mark the lives of so many people in the world, end quote. In an exemplary way, O'Neill has shown, through her academic work and her public service, how philosophy can become relevant to civic and political life. Professor O'Neill has published 12 books, and in addition to her scholarship on philosophy, she has written on a host of subjects, ranging from bioethics, human rights, end-of-life care, to the question of trust or trustworthiness in public life. Onora O'Neill was born in Northern Ireland in 1941 and educated in Germany, Britain, and the United States. She studied philosophy at the University of Oxford under the tutorship of Elizabeth Anscombe and Philippa Foot, and she later pursued her doctoral degree in philosophy at Harvard University under the supervision of John Rawls. After teaching for a few years at Barnett College, Columbia University in New York, Onora O'Neill returned to the UK in 1978 when she took up a lectureship in philosophy at the University of Essex, where she also became professor in 1987. In 1992, she was appointed principal of Newnham College at the University of Cambridge, where she is today honorary professor of philosophy emeritus. O'Neill was made a life peer in the House of Lords in 1999 and she has served on countless policy committees and public advisory boards, including the Nuffield Council on Bioethics and the Human Advisory Commission, as well as the Human Genetic Advisory Commission. In addition, she has served on the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which she also chaired. She's now a member of the Banking Standard Board, tasked with improving banking culture and accountability in the UK. O'Neill has been president of the British Academy, and has served as chairperson of the British Philosophical Association. She's currently a foreign member of the Royal Irish Academy, of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and of the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences, and of the Norwegian Academy. She was made Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society in 2007. Professor O'Neill has been awarded over 20 honorary degrees from universities in the UK and in Europe. The symposium today is organized in honor of Professor O'Neill to celebrate her receiving the 27th Holberg Prize. The theme, Ethics for Communication, is a theme of her own choice. And in addition, the laureate has been free to invite whomever she wishes to participate in this event. The only requirement that the Holberg Prize has imposed on her choices is that at least one of the participants should be a younger scholar, given that one of the ambitions of the Holberg Prize is to create arenas for communication across generations. Professor O'Neill has preferred to introduce the speakers herself, and I will therefore ask the laureate to come to the podium to present the theme for today's symposium and introduce the three first speakers. Professor O'Neill, the podium is yours.
Good morning. This is rather wonderful and daunting. It's a topic I care about, and here others are to do the work. Let me, however, say just a few words about why I thought this topic might be one that we would all want to think about. It's not entirely a familiar phrase, ethics for communication. Today, we tend to talk about freedom of expression, a 20th century phrase, and I think often a phrase that is misconstrued. Particularly in the United Kingdom, we think a lot about John Stuart Mill's work on freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Mill distinguished quite sharply between individuals' rights of self-expression and the reasons we have for thinking that the expression, not self-expression, of the press, of the media, as we have to say today, matters. I think he was right to draw that distinction, and in addition, a continual emphasis on the question of freedom of expression makes it seem that it is the rights of the speaker, writer, broadcaster, or press organization that are our concern, whereas probably our concern is also with what I have come to call, but it's not yet a familiar phrase, speech duties. What are the duties of these participants, of individuals and of organizations? Nothing new in that, after all. If you go back a long way, let's go as far as the 10 Commandments. 2 of the 10 are about speech duties. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, and thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. It's as ancient as can be to think about the duties that we have with respect to speech and communication, which of course is not to say that anybody imagines that having some institution that controls our speech and our writing is a good idea, far from it. However, it seems to me, and this is what I shall speak about after lunch today, that it is very important to try to think what we should do and not merely what we should get. And a tendency to think about freedom of expression has represented a tendency to focus on what others owe us rather than what we owe. Enough of my own perspective in why I chose this particular topic. Ellen Mortensen very acutely, the last exchange we had, said, do you mean ethics of communication or ethics for communication? And I realized when she asked me, I've used both phrases, and having to think which is more apt, I thought, yes, the ethics are for the communication, and it distances that little bit more from the idea that what we are looking at is rights to express thoughts and content. Now, quite separately from these rather philosophical considerations, there is a reason why today's topic seems to me to be important for all of us, in that the politics of this year globally has led rather obviously to a concern with the form that freedom of expression is now taking in public life. Some people blame the technologies. They think that it is, so to speak, Mr. Twitter, Mr. Trump. We'll keep that one among ourselves. Some people think it is Twitter or Facebook that is the problem. I'm much less sure than they. I think that it might be important for us to focus less on the technologies and more on the particular ways in which they are being used or misused, in which they are being controlled or not controlled. And I'm extraordinarily happy that we have got to speak today a mixture of philosophers who work in this area and people who do things much closer to the media. And the two halves of this morning's discussion are divided so that we have both perspectives. Now, I'm not going to read you the biographies of our very distinguished panelists, and I'm just so grateful that they could come, but we will start in the first panel, Jonathan Heawood, who is directing a press self-regulating body in the UK, Impress. And I didn't make a mistake, Jonathan, with that name, because there is another press self-regulating body about which we will not speak immediately. That it means that we have a voice, so to speak, from very much the front line of these struggles to start out with. In the first session also, we have Rowan Cruft, who has just been promoted to a chair at the University of Stirling in Scotland, and who writes predominantly on human rights, and also Laura Valentini, who's got the fascinating topic of audience responsibilities. The details of what they all do you can read. I won't introduce the lineup for after our coffee break. I will do so then, but I will ask Ellen to come back and be in charge. I get to listen, and so do you, and we shall have a terrific morning. Thank you.
One of the rights of the speaker is to have a glass of water. Thank you very much, Onora. I have to say it's a real honor to be here and to have been invited by you to join you in Bergen for this occasion. I'm also very, very grateful to Ellen, Hilda Marie, the organizers of the Holberg Prize, and all the volunteers who've made our stay here very enjoyable. I have to just add to what Onora has already said and make a kind of confession and a kind of apology to those of you who are philosophers. I'm not a philosopher. Now, in the UK, there's no great shame in not being a philosopher. In fact, there is some shame in being a philosopher. I say that as the son of a philosopher. we treat our philosophers with disdain, I'm afraid, and even in some cases with contempt. We say they live in ivory towers, that they are idealists, dreamers, utopians, obscurantists. So at home, I might take some pride in not being a philosopher. But on this platform and in this company, I am slightly embarrassed about it. But on the other hand, our topic, communication, ethics, has great implications, as Onora has said, for what we non-philosophers like to call the real world. These questions are not abstract. We're asking what good is served by communication, and in particular, what good is served by the form of communication that we call news. We're asking what conditions need to be in place to achieve that good. Now, these challenges have obvious and immediate bearings on practical questions of media law and media policy, both at a national and perhaps at an international level. And furthermore, we're here because of Onora O'Neill, one of the most public of public intellectuals. With roles both at Cambridge and in the House of Lords, Onora is certainly not confined to the ivory tower. Her philosophical concerns are rooted in the challenges that face policymakers, and her policymaking, I believe, is rooted in her philosophical sensibility. So maybe it's appropriate that I'm here as a non-philosopher and that, like Onora, perhaps, I sit somewhere on the bridge between the academy and those other cultures in what we call the real world. But it's not always very comfortable to sit on a bridge. This particular bridge is not very well built, and it's not very well looked after. Philosophers who cross the bridge into the real world may find it hard to return to the academy, and politicians and others who cross the bridge into the academy may be mocked by their peers for giving up on reality. There are perils at both ends of the bridge, and there are trolls lurking beneath the bridge anonymously, always happy to criticize anyone for anything at any time. Nonetheless, this bridge between academic philosophy and other cultures is fundamentally important to our society. Onora has shown how this bridge can be crossed in both directions. And today, I think I want to ask what can be done to strengthen this bridge, to enable more of us to cross it productively in both directions. Now, Onora's insight into press freedom and communication ethics has gained wide currency among both academics and policymakers in the UK. It underpins the framework for press regulation, which we've developed in this country, following the Leveson inquiry into the culture, practices, and ethics of the press. However, Onora's account of press freedom has been almost entirely ignored by the press itself. Now, there may be obvious reasons for this. Newspaper publishers may not want to listen to anyone who calls on them to act more transparently or to take greater care to ensure that what they publish is accurate. However, there may also be more subtle reasons for the news industry's rejection of these ethics of or for communication. And these reasons, I suggest, go deep into the culture of the industry. Cultural factors which go beyond straightforward commercial self-interest. In fact, journalists on some occasions may well be acting against their self-interest when they reject this new ethical approach and its regulatory implications. So I want to talk briefly today about this clash between the ethics of communication as this emerges from academic philosophy and it comes via the courts and parliament, and the culture of communication as this is developed in newspaper newsrooms in the UK and around the world over the course of the 20th century. I want to suggest that whilst this clash may be very frustrating, even infuriating for some of us who are trying to work at the interface between these two worlds, nonetheless, we need to take it seriously. We need to take the drivers for this clash seriously. We need to attend to the cultural factors that make communication between these two worlds so difficult. And we should also seek to resolve this conflict. But I think we have to be realistic that this is a generational challenge and one that may not be won on the quality of argument alone. And in that, perhaps I'm posing a challenge to the philosophers here. Now look, my academic background, like Ellen's, was in literature, the study of literature, and then for many years I worked as a journalist and as a campaigner for press freedom. And in those days, looking back now, I have to say I think I led a rather simple life. I believed in the classical liberal orthodoxies: free speech, press freedom, the liberty that John Milton articulated to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties. And as a journalist and activist, I defended the freedom of the press, even when some British newspapers made that quite difficult. I argued pretty staunchly that the rights of journalists outweighed other considerations. I quoted Milton, Mill, and Orwell, and anyone who dared to question this received wisdom. I didn't actually think of my beliefs as beliefs. I thought of them as truths. And then I met Onora O'Neill. And that was the end of my simple liberal life. And as it happens, I think, I may have misremembered this may be fake news, but I think we met over pizza in a small town in Scotland. We were there invited by Rowan, who's here today, to attend a conference at the University of Stirling. And the conference was designed to bring together human rights practitioners and scholars. I was there at that time as a campaigner, someone who got my hands dirty, and others were there as scholars blinking in the light of day. And I expected the scholars to treat the campaigners with some respect. After all, I thought we were the ones who did the real work. But Onora didn't show a huge amount of that kind of, well, certainly no deference. She took me to pieces. She argued that the ideal of press freedom, of which I was so proud to be an advocate, was flawed, both in its conception and in its articulation, its application. Now, I can't do full justice to Onora's arguments, and I'm hoping very much that she'll set them out for all of us this afternoon, but I'll try to summarize them. Milton had argued, as we know, that the press must be free from prior restraint in order to create the conditions in which intellectual and religious debate could flourish. He described, not in these terms, but he broadly described a marketplace of ideas. That language came later. But the marketplace of ideas in which freedom from restraint was both a necessary and, it seems, a sufficient condition for truth to emerge. Onora, by contrast, argued that this marketplace of ideas could not be such a libertarian one if it were to achieve its truth-seeking purpose. It could not be characterized only by freedom from restraint. She argued that if we are serious about helping truth to emerge, then that market must be organized in such a way as to make that possible. Freedom from prior restraint may be a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. And she concluded that the modern conception of press freedom, in which the freedom of journalists and, by extension, newspaper owners is seen as paramount, that conception was so profoundly flawed as to represent almost a perfect reversal of what press freedom should achieve. By privileging the rights of such speakers, regardless of their commitment to truth or truth-seeking, and regardless of whether they're even human beings or multinational corporations, we in fact make it less likely that truth will emerge. And in effect, Onora turned press freedom on its head. She showed me at least, that the beneficiaries of that freedom, the rights holders, as it were, must be the recipients of news, not its producers, the audience, not the speaker. Now, this may sound like a philosophical nicety. How many angels does it take to dance on the head of a pin? But actually, I think the implications are tremendous. If we come at questions of media law and policy from the perspective of news publishers, we will devise an approach that primarily serves to protect their rights. That approach might incidentally protect the rights of others, but that won't be its main thrust. So we might, for instance, say that in order to protect the freedom of news publishers, they should not be externally regulated. Now, this might have the incidental benefit of ensuring that news publishers are not subject to political oversight. That, in turn, might help to ensure that the public received uncensored information about political goings-on. However, the lack of external regulation might also cause the public considerable harm, for example, through the publication of inaccurate or distorted information about political goings-on. Whether or not the public are actually served in this paradigm appears to be less important than the idea that they are served by a press which is free from external regulation. But if we come at this and we set out through media law and policy to uphold the interests of news consumers, or what I call news citizens, we're likely to address these questions in a very different way. We might say that news citizens have a considerable interest in receiving political information that is accurate and free from distortion, and that news publishers should therefore be externally regulated to ensure that the public do indeed receive such information, or that at least they are more likely to receive accurate than inaccurate information. We might also say, noting the risk of censorship, we might say that any model of external regulation must be subject to checks and balances to mitigate any such risk of political control. But we would not on principle be opposed to state involvement in the establishment or oversight of any such regulatory framework. Now, for me, sitting over pizza in Stirling 7 or 8 years ago now, I think, this was a bridge too far. Onora had turned my principles upside down. She'd unsettled me. But most importantly, I have to say, she had made me think. And that thinking went on for several years after that initial conversation. And Onora also helped Sir Brian Leveson to think when he was asked by the British government to address the scandal of phone hacking by certain newspapers, certain national newspaper groups. Leveson looked at the system of self-regulation, which we've had in the UK for almost half a century. He asked why that system had been so unable and apparently unwilling to investigate and address allegations of phone hacking and other abuses of journalism. He concluded that the system of self-regulation was flawed, and that whilst we should keep press regulation out of the hands of politicians, we should also keep it out of the hands of newspaper owners. And in his report, Leveson quoted Onora, who had told him that self-regulation is too easily blurred into self-interested regulation by newspaper owners. And Leveson clearly agreed. So in place of that pure form of self-regulation, he recommended a system of what he called independent self-regulation, or what's often called co-regulation, whereby a self-regulatory body is overseen by a statutory body. The regulator itself is still independent of the state, the press is still utterly independent of the state, but the state takes responsibility for ensuring that the system as a whole is geared towards the truth-seeking interests of the public rather than the commercial or political interests of publishers. That's the theory. Let's go back to that bridge I mentioned earlier, the bridge between academic philosophy and other cultures. Onora crossed this bridge very successfully with her new ethics. She set out from a culture of academic philosophy in which rational argument is valued very highly. On the other side of the bridge, she encountered 3 quite separate cultures, each with their own very different attitudes towards evidence, argument, and truth. So let's go back and imagine that we're taking this journey with Onora. It's a bit like a kind of Norwegian fairy tale with a bridge and trolls and so on. Let's cross the first bridge. We find ourselves in judicial culture, a subset of legal culture, in the person of Sir Brian Leveson, an appeal court judge who chaired the public inquiry. As an appeal court judge, Sir Brian is trained to weigh competing evidence in the scales of justice. He's trained to test hypotheses against first principles and to apply a range of considerations when forming a judgment. He's valued for his disinterest, his dispassion, his lack of bias. Now, in these ways, judicial culture resembles academic culture, and perhaps it's unsurprising that Sir Brian was receptive to Onora's line of argument. So we successfully pass our first hurdle, our first challenge in this fairy tale, and we proceed to our next bridge, the bridge which leads into political culture. Not so straightforward. Politicians are not trained to weigh competing evidence, to return to first principles, or to act without bias. Quite the opposite. We value politicians for the way they exercise power according to certain values. In a democracy, political power is supposed to be exercised in the public interest, but we give politicians extraordinarily broad scope to interpret the public interest according to their own very different values. We don't expect them to reach consensus or to follow the evidence to a, quote, rational conclusion. Politicians are open to arguments, but those arguments will always be tested against their values or their purported values and their need to gain and retain power through election. And it's very rare in British history for politicians to challenge the press. Gaining and retaining power has depended or has been thought to depend too heavily on the support of certain newspapers. And even if, in fact, the press does not determine the outcome of elections, and I think the academic jury is slightly out on that one, the press certainly has the power to make life very difficult for politicians who displease it. But there were pretty unique circumstances politically in the UK in 2013 after Leveson published his report. The Conservative Party was in coalition government with the Liberal Democrats, and the Labour Party was already receiving very hostile press coverage and thus arguably had nothing to lose. And at that point, the Leveson recommendations were implemented by politicians working across party lines. They put in place the legal operating framework for a future self-regulator. Now, some would say, and their critics would say, that these politicians were acting in narrow self-interest, that politicians have always wanted to muzzle the press and that they seized the chance to do so. However, this account, which I often hear when I'm debating with representatives of the press, conveniently ignores the fact that this framework, the post-Leveson framework, doesn't give politicians any control over the press or over press regulation. It asks them to take responsibility for establishing the framework for regulation, but it's very careful not to give them any power over that framework. In any case, whether they acted in the public interest or in self-interest, the result was the same. Parliament established the legal framework for Leveson's model of independent self-regulation, underpinned by Onora's account of communication ethics. So, we've crossed the bridge from academic philosophy, we've encountered judicial culture, which was welcoming, political culture, which was helpful, as it happens, for whatever reason, and now we encounter press culture, and here it gets really difficult. Just as academic culture privileges rational debate, judicial culture privileges evidence and justice, and political culture privileges values and power, so press culture obviously has its own norms. Press culture says that journalists in fact exist to speak truth to power, that journalists sit outside the political establishment, that the press is a kind of fourth estate which exists to hold the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary to account, and that therefore the greatest enemies of the press are agents of the state, chief among them politicians. Now, these norms may or may not reflect the reality of what journalists and news publishers actually do. They may be more like a comforting fairy tale about the importance of the press than an empirical description of what the press does. There is, for instance, a lot of evidence to show that parts of the press and the political establishment in the UK are much more closely aligned with each other's interests and values than this myth would suggest. But the myth is no less powerful for that. And I remembered when I was writing this that I think the CEO of Ford Cars, the enormous American automobile giant, faced with a clash between his strategy for the company and the culture that was at large within the company, famously observed that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I was thinking, does culture eat ethics? And I think, yes, but more than that, culture absorbs ethics. Or to put it another way, culture incorporates ethical elements in its dominant narratives. So press culture has very effectively absorbed certain ethical ideas over the past few hundred years. It doesn't matter whether or not a journalist has actually read Milton, Mill, Orwell. He or she has certainly absorbed the idea that the press holds the state to account and that therefore state regulation is anathema. Thus, the culture of the British press, and this is quite separate from the narrow self-interest of perhaps those 8 or 10 men who own the majority of the British press. This is the 100,000 journalists working within the press. That culture has largely, I'm afraid, turned against the ethical analysis promoted by Onora, enshrined in the Leveson report, and, unfortunately for me, embodied in my own organisation, Impress. Now, I designed Impress to be the regulator that Leveson recommended, independent of the press and politicians, but accountable to the public via a statutory oversight body, the Press Recognition Panel, which was set up by government but is operationally independent. And the role of that oversight body, the PRP, is simply to confirm that Impress or any other self-regulatory body which puts itself forward satisfies the Leveson recommendations. And last October, the PRP did confirm that Impress meets that standard, satisfies those recommendations, and we thereby became the first recognised regulator in British history. And just to be clear about the facts here, Impress has no jurisdiction over the press in general. We simply resolve complaints and disputes in relation to those news publications which voluntarily sign up to us. And we've so far been joined by about 70 publications from across the UK, which together reach around 3 million people per month in print and online. Now, these are respectable audience figures, but they're tiny in comparison to the market share of the national and regional newspapers, which continue to dominate the industry and its culture. And because those newspapers are at the heart of that culture, they refuse to join Impress. They have spurned the Leveson recommendations, and they have persuaded the government with which they are apparently at such odds, they have persuaded that government to pledge to undo the cross-party work that was done in the wake of the Leveson inquiry back in 2013. So in many ways, it looks like we may be back where we started. Now, we could condemn this response as self-interested. We could say that the journalists who have rejected Impress are malign, unethical. But I don't think that would be fair or accurate, because press culture is not unethical. It is, in fact, built upon clear ethical foundations. It maintains that journalism serves society. On this much, at least, press culture agrees with Onora. However, press culture says that journalism serves society by standing outside society. It says that a free marketplace of ideas, however dysfunctional, is preferable to a regulated marketplace. It takes certain assumptions as gospel truths, that politicians always want to censor the press, that editors are always the best guardians of journalistic standards, and that state involvement in press regulation is therefore simply unthinkable. So, on one hand, we have the culture of the press, which has absorbed and remodeled in its own image certain ethical norms. Now, these norms are held as truths by members of this culture, regardless of the fact that professional ethicists, such as Onora, have rejected them. On the other hand, we have what I call the new ethics of communication, or the new ethics for communication, proposed by Onora, accepted by many of us here, endorsed by Sir Brian Leveson, and embodied in my own organisation, Impress, and the legal framework that was created by Parliament back in 2013. It feels like an unbridgeable divide. Where do we go from here? Does it matter that this bridge between culture and ethics seems to be so broken? Yes, I think it does. Should we expect the press to embrace a challenging new ethical analysis with open arms? No. Should we expect philosophers to retract such an analysis simply because it has been rejected by the press? No. Should we look for more opportunities for engagement between these two worlds of academic philosophy and news publishing, both of which, to be fair, have their cultural and their ethical dimensions, their blind spots, their preferences, their biases. Yes, we should look for more engagement, but I'm afraid you shouldn't hold your breath expecting that to happen anytime soon or to any great extent. And in fact, to conclude, I have to say, I suspect that if anything is going to change this debate, I think that game changer will probably come from somewhere else entirely. All cultures are geared against change, but they do respond eventually to pressure. Perhaps not to philosophical pressure, sadly, but certainly to economic pressure. And the press is currently bowing, if not quite collapsing, under that pressure as audience attention and advertising revenue flows away from the old media institutions and into the pockets of the new media giants, and dominant among them, Google and Facebook. Now, in response, in the UK at least, I don't know if it's the same in Norway, the press are calling for, guess what, regulatory intervention against the media, just not against their part of the media, but against Google and Facebook. And in order to justify these interventions, representatives of the press are appealing to arguments which I think are, rather ironically, quite like Onora's. They draw our attention to the harm that can be caused by the circulation of hate speech online. This is harm that's caused to the audience, of course, not to the exponent of hate speech, whose rights are apparently now secondary. The press deplore the use of social media by terrorists and their sympathizers, on the basis, of course, of the harm that terrorists cause to society. And they rail against the rise of fake news, aided and abetted by intermediaries such as Facebook and Twitter. Now, in all of these examples, the growing critique by the old news media of the new news media is grounded in an appeal to the needs, interests, and rights of the audience, of society, not those of the speaker or their intermediary. So, just as the press have been capable of taking and absorbing elements from the old ethics for communication, so it seems they're quite capable of taking and absorbing elements from the new ethics for communication when it suits them. Perhaps they're nothing more than intellectual magpies, attracted by shiny and useful ideas that they can collect and take into their nest and use as they see fit. But at least there is this. Their shared use of this new ethical language creates an opportunity, an opening, it may be a very narrow one, but an opening for dialogue. If we're all talking about the interests of the audience, of society as a whole, then at least we are all talking. And if our conversation leads to some shared thinking about the regulatory framework, the future regulatory framework that might best meet those needs, taking into account the role played by both the old news media and the new news media, then I think we're really talking. Thank you.
I'll just get my water. Hold on. So thank you, Jonathan. I think, at least at the start of my talk, I'm going to be hopping back over those bridges of Jonathan's back into the ivory tower, but we will start walking out from that about a third of the way through the talk. I just want to start by repeating what Jonathan said at the start of his talk. It's a great honor to be here. It's wonderful to honor Baroness Onora O'Neill and to do so in the name of Ludwig Holberg. Many thanks to our hosts as well, to the Holberg Committee and all the work they've done. Okay, I'm just wondering how do I change slides when I need to? Do I just press this? I assume I do. We'll see. Anyway, Onora O'Neill's work has defined many fields: Kantian scholarship, political philosophy, most recently a focus on the ethics for communication. And I just want to start by pausing briefly on the first book of hers that I engaged with closely. This is her 1996 book, Towards Justice and Virtue. And in this book, she defends principles rejecting injury and indifference to others, on the basis that principles that allow injury or indifference can't be universally followed and adopted by everyone together. And to put it roughly, her idea is this: it's that reasons and principles guiding action must be able to be grasped and followed by all of us. A principle that some people could not possibly adopt could not be a genuine ethical principle. And now an injured or an abandoned person couldn't adopt principles permitting their own injury or abandonment. If you've been severely injured, you can't adopt principles at all. So if we want principles that all people could adopt, we need to reject injury and indifference. And from this start, O'Neill goes on to derive a wide-ranging ethical theory in which duty plays a central role. Now, several themes from this and her earlier books resonate in her recent work on communication and media ethics, and I'm going to return to them. Beforehand, a brief word about my own research. This is focused on the idea of rights. Unlike O'Neill, I see some attractions in what's sometimes called a teleological view of rights. In particular, I'm attracted to the view that if there are any natural or moral rights, where this means rights that exist independently of law or social convention, rights that exist whether or not anyone's spotted that they exist, then these are going to be rights that exist because they serve the right holder's interests, needs, or freedoms. That's my view. And on this basis, I think we can defend individual rights to freedom of expression and communication as something like natural rights, justified by the way in which expression and communication are important for the individual right holder, independently of whether this serves the wider public good. But we should note that this approach draws a very sharp distinction between the communicative rights of individual persons and the communicative rights of media organizations or other corporations. And this is because the interests or needs of artificial entities, things like Microsoft or the Times, say, these have no moral importance as such. They deserve respect only insofar as this serves individual persons. So if Microsoft collapses, that's only a problem if it damages people. Whereas if you collapse, it's a problem independently of whether anyone else is damaged. It's a problem in itself. Your interests are themselves morally important. So on my view, artificial entities' rights of communication should be treated very differently to the rights of individuals. Now, in her recent books and articles, O'Neill highlights the limitations of the right-based approach I've just outlined. And much of O'Neill's work here seeks to broaden our conception of the goods that expression or communication secure, so that we focus beyond goods to the expresser or communicator, and rather consider wider common goods and principles. And for O'Neill, democracy is one of the most important of these wider goods which duties and rights of communication should serve. And here she follows a tradition traceable from Aristotle to Mill. And I endorse this view that an ethics of communication must serve or instantiate the values of democracy, and that this is an essential complement to any right-holder-focused justification of the right to freedom of speech. This is where I find out whether this makes a difference. No? What do I press? Just next. There. Brilliant. Okay. There are only 2 slides. This is one of 2 coming slides, so don't expect fireworks, I'm afraid. Okay. In my contribution to this symposium, I'm going to examine 3 aspects of the democratic case for free speech. And I'll say more about them in relation to this slide. These aspects reflect 3 ways of defending democracy. First, many contemporary theorists highlight the instrumental value of democracy as a means of pooling the opinions of the diverse members of society who make up the electorate. It's sometimes called the epistemic defense of democracy, number 1 up there. It defends democracy on the ground that by letting everyone have a say in political decisions, democracy ensures that nobody's knowledge is excluded from our decision-making. A second popular view defends democracy on the basis that it's required by a moral principle of equal respect. That's number 2 up there. This view says, look, independently of the huge epistemic costs of excluding, think of historical exclusions, propertyless people or women, there's huge epistemic costs in excluding them. But independently of that, it's also just morally repugnant in itself to exclude these people. It violates the principle of equal respect. And we should note that this equality defense of democracy is often linked to the idea of self-determination. If I'm excluded from political decisions made by others, then laws imposed on me by these decisions will not be self-imposed by me, they'll be external impositions. Now, I believe both the epistemic and the equality defenses of democracy play a major role in O'Neill's work on the ethics of communication. They underpin some of her doubts about an unlimited right to freedom of expression. If rights of communication are importantly grounded by their epistemic role, in helping people come to true beliefs, then duties to communicate intelligibly, with one's trustworthiness clearly accessible. These will have a central place, and O'Neill stresses these. If rights of communication are grounded by their role in securing equality, then imbalances of power between communicators should be a concern, especially, I'd say, imbalances in favour of corporations. And O'Neill's recently put this in the following, this is a little quotation. She says, any adequate configuration of media speech rights has to take the realities of power and vulnerability seriously. Now, what I want to do in this talk is to think a little bit about what I'm now going to introduce as the third case for democracy, which I see as separate and complementary to the epistemic case and the equality principle. This is the idea of democracy as a form of joint or collective action. Democracy enables the state's actions to be our actions. And I believe that what the state does in a proper democracy should be our action, where we are all citizens, or perhaps all inhabitants of the state's territory. This idea of democratic state action as collective action is closely related both to the equality defense of democracy and to the ideal of self-determination, for which equality is necessary. So I think equality and collective action don't have to go together. You can imagine a highly fragmented society which secures formal equality of participation at the ballot box. But is that really genuinely joint action if it's so fragmented? You can also imagine a deeply hierarchical society that in some sense acts as one if every member believes in the hierarchical system. So even though I'd say sort of versions of joint action are possible without equality, in my view, an ideal of joint action requires equality. And so even though forms of self-determination by a group might be possible with formal equality that doesn't secure genuinely joint action, an ideal of self-determination by a group requires the group engage in joint action. So that's why I've got those funny arrows and things up there. The thought is, for the best form of equality delivers a form of joint action and vice versa. The best form of joint action requires equality. Together, that delivers an ideal of self-determination, or is necessary for the best form of self-determination. In addition, I'd like to claim that joint action is a good in itself. And this is a speculative point I'm not going to fully defend here, but I'd suggest that being part of a genuinely joint agent is an important good for each human. And this isn't just for psychological reasons about the importance of feelings of belonging. I'm tempted by the radical claim that often there's actually no metaphysical priority to individual action vis-à-vis joint action. So I think it's quite natural for us to think of a group's action as constituted by the action of the individuals who make it up. I want to suggest quite often it should be natural to think the other way around too, that my actions as an individual writing philosophy, cooking dinner, are constituted by the group actions within which they fall, group actions constituted, say, by a tradition of philosophical discussion. Now, I don't know whether that's correct. Even if it's not correct, though, it seems to me that an important case for democracy is that it constitutes state action as group action. This is a necessary condition for genuine self-determination. Only if democratic decisions are genuinely our decisions, rather than simply the decisions of a majority within a fragmented set of people, will the democracy govern legitimately. Well, my argument in the remainder of this talk will be that this collective action defense of democracy generates interestingly distinctive norms for communication and interestingly distinctive limits on rights to freedom of expression. And I'm going to suggest we can learn by attending more closely to these norms sourced in the conditions for collective action. So, my final slide, though we've got a lot of talk still to go. Let's dwell on some of the problems in contemporary political communication. Some of these are problems whose problematic nature can be explained fully by the epistemic inequality cases for democracy. The problematic nature of others, I argue, emerges only if we're committed to democracy as genuinely collective action. So here's my sort of personal selection of the problems. One is echo chambers. This is the phenomenon of people closing themselves off from chance encounters with dissenting views, focusing only on communications that reinforce what they already believe. And in Cass Sunstein's book, #Republic, his little quotation, he says, examining the behavior of 727 people over a 6-week period, R. Kelly Garrett found that people are significantly more likely to click on information that reinforces their views, somewhat less likely to expose themselves to information that contradicts these views. And I'm sure we've all found ourselves doing that ourselves. I remember hearing also that in the recent Brexit referendum in the UK, this is the electoral occasion, I believe, where you were least likely to know anyone who voted in a way that was different to the way you voted. An example of echo chambers in action. The second problem I want to pause on is adversarialism. So I think in much of the English-speaking world, it's assumed that the form of political debate should be adversarial. Media list winners and losers from budget decisions. Political interviewers take their task to be attack. I'll say something about the positive case for this in a moment, but it seems to me also to be a problem. Partly because it excludes the possibility that a view might fall somewhere between winning and losing. I think it's also a problem because it encourages a sort of insincere pose on the part of interviewers and interviewees, who will pretend to be adversaries, whatever their views. Third problem, spectacle or drama. So, as Guy Debord might stress, much political communication is presented as a show for viewers or readers to observe and perhaps consume, but not to participate in. This is as evident in newspapers as in visual media. So here are some examples. Business confidence, inflation rates, taxes. They're rarely reported simply as rising or falling or having been adjusted. Rather, they leap, or they get hiked, or they plummet, or they plunge. These changes don't just have effects, they hit or target particular groups. Politicians are held up to actors' standards of presentation. We have politicians accused of forgetting their lines or leaving their microphones on at the wrong time. And, I mean, to my mind, this presentation as spectacle makes any topic seem both more serious than it really is, because of the extreme language and the theatrical standards used, and in a different way makes it seem less serious by distancing it from the mundane and non-spectacular in which we live. Now, I sometimes think this is actually a personal problem of my own. I don't know if all the rest of you share it. I can't listen for long to any news interview because I find this sort of spectacularization just really turns me off. And I've been trying to work out why it is. I think it is this sense that it on the one hand makes it seem more serious and less serious. It's strange. The fourth problem up there, which I'll be very brief on because it seems so obvious to me, is market language. The view of the voter as a market consumer of a product purveyed by a political party. I think it's obviously pervasive. In the current UK general election, both party manifestos were described as the party's offer, as if we vote as a consumers choosing which offer we're going to buy. As I often say, have you bought this policy? And I think that misrepresents what's going on. We together are choosing how we'll live together for the next 5 years. We're not buying a policy. Fifth problem, treating some people as parametric. Where parametric here means treating people as a parameter in the mathematical sense of a constant, something that's taken as unchanging. Now, this idea needs some explaining. And before I do so, I'll just point out it might actually seem like an odd point with which to end this list of communicative problems. You know, what about the fact that it's easy to disseminate falsehoods widely on the internet? The fact it's very hard to know what media source to trust? Well, these are important problems on which O'Neill has worked. We've heard Jonathan talk about some of them. But I think there's also something interesting to learn from this last problem. And I take the idea from a brief essay by Philip Pettit on the nature of consequentialism. There's a quotation here on your slide there. What he distinguishes between what I can justify in a context where other agents are treated as parametric, where this means as given aspects of nature with which I cannot expect to engage, and what I can justify in a context where other agents are treated as being on a par with me. Now, very often political discussions treat certain groups as immovable parameters in this way. We see this in the dismissal of certain groups as not worth arguing with. I think sometimes we see it in academic discussions in political science or theory, which focus in a detached way on a group as an object of study. I think the most pervasive treatment of others as parametric is simply the tendency to think of a group in the third person, as them, rather than as members of some first person or us. So think about references by those in power to the people as them, who must be pacified. Maybe think about the controversy over François Hollande's reported reference to les sans-dents. Alternatively, think of references to the governing class as them, as the establishment or the man, an unavoidable power to be handled rather than reasoned with. Now, I think, as the example of the man shows, sometimes this parametric conception of some people is completely justified. It's the right way to think about them. If they really are an unavoidable external imposition on me, then in some sense I'm right to treat them as a given aspect of nature. Similarly, it might well be right, say, think about a tactical voter. For a tactical voter to give up on persuading her peers to vote for what she believes in, if you know that people aren't going to change, why should you continue to engage with them argumentatively as if you think you might be able to sway them? And yet I think media communications that engage in or encourage this way of thinking are problematic. Thinking of others in this way is in a certain sense solipsistic or objectifying. I was actually reminded of my fellow symposiast, Langton, some of the work she's done on the objectification involved in pornographic speech. I think some things like that are going on, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute when you think of your interlocutors as parametric. Beforehand, though, I just want to step back for a minute. I'm going to come back to this. Recall my initial focus on how an ethics of communication might go beyond the good to the individual of their own freedom of expression. I said that O'Neill urges us to consider the wider public good of communication's role in a democracy, and recall the three justifications of democracy as a means for pooling our diverse knowledge, as instantiating a principle of equality, and as constituting a people as a joint agent, able to impose laws on itself. Well, if we think about these justifications in relation to the problems identified on the slide, I think we get some interesting results. So think about the epistemic defense of democracy. This is going to find problems in the top one, in echo chambers, just as it will with fake news or problems of trust. Anything that's going to damage electors' epistemic competence will be condemned by the epistemic defense of democracy. It's not clear to me, though, that the epistemic defense need find adversarialism, number 2, or the spectacle-like dramatization or market language, or indeed the treatment of some to be parametric. It's not clear that those are problems on the epistemic approach. In fact, we might be able to defend adversarialism and dramatization as ways of testing the robustness of particular beliefs. And if some people just aren't going to change their beliefs, it seems epistemically warranted to treat them as immovable parameters. So if we believe in that epistemic defense of democracy, I think we're sort of stuck, in my case at least, if I find all these things problematic, but it doesn't explain why they're all problematic. Only explains why the first one is. Similarly, the equality defense of democracy is going to find problems in echo chambers that reinforce power imbalances, as well as in market-driven inequalities in participatory power. And treating people as parameters who can't be influenced by reason, I think, is inconsistent with treating them as equal to oneself. But I'm less clear about why adversarialism, or politics as spectacle, or market language, why these have to be always inconsistent with the equality principle. And so my contrast, then, I suggest, is that the view of democracy as joint action can illuminate the problematic nature of all the problems I identified. So I'm trying to think, what do I not like about current media? Well, really, all of these are problematic because they stop or impede the idea of democracy as a joint action. Echo chambers and adversarial stances can't represent our fundamental relations to our fellows if we're to constitute a first-person, plural subject acting together. If an election is our choice for how to live together over the next 5 years, then, as I said before, I think the market view of it is highly distorting. Markets coordinate disparate individual decisions in pursuit of disparate goals without bringing the participants together as one group, making a shared choice. Similarly, I think the passivity created by dramatically presented spectacles of political debate is inconsistent with genuine joint action performed by a group that brings together both presenters and audience. So if you think about the norms of the theatre or the spectacle, they rule out the equal interaction required, say, if there's actually an accidental theatre fire and the actors and audience together have to work to put them out. When that happens, the drama on the stage has ceased. The norms that distinguish actors from audience have been extinguished. And with the norms in place, properly joint action of this type seems to me not to be fully possible. I find the problems of parametric thinking especially interesting. So think back to my opening remarks about O'Neill's book on book Towards Justice and Virtue. There she argues that any genuine principle of practical reasoning must in some sense be able to be grasped and followed by all of us. It must be a principle from which anyone could reason. This applies both to principles governing individual action and joint action. Now, when I treat someone as an immovable parameter, one of the things I might be doing is simply taking them to be immovable by reason at all, like a rock. And then I clearly can't be taking them to be part of a group of agents of whom I'm also a part, a group that can together engage in joint action. For action, as opposed to maybe the movement of the planets, has to be responsive to reason. An alternative way in which I can treat someone as parametric is for me to treat them as responsive to reason, but to not try to engage them by the very same reasons that move me. So here are some examples. If I ask for your assistance by drawing your attention to my own neediness or my own freedom, I thereby try to make the reason that motivates me, my need or freedom, my need for such and such, the same reason that will motivate you. I'm saying, I'm hoping that you will find my need something that motivates you to help me. If instead I compel your assistance by threatening to hit you unless you assist me, I thereby try to motivate you by a reason that's not my own motivation. My aim is that you be motivated by fear of being hit, And I'm not going to be motivated by fear of being hit. I'm motivated by my need or whatever it is, the thing that's got me to make this threat. So I'm trying to give you a reason that isn't my own reason. In the latter scenario, I think O'Neill's argument explains why what I've offered you is not a genuine ethical reason. For making your reason to act something I know is not going to be my reason, I'm not acting on a principle that can be grasped and acted on at once by both you and me. And I think we often decide to treat some group as parametric in this way, by lazily failing to attempt to engage the relevant party's reason with the same reasons that motivate us. Instead, we seek to motivate the relevant parties to our own ends, even good or worthwhile ends, through factors that we don't ourselves regard as our own reasons. And personally, I think there was a lot of this going on both sides in the campaigns in the UK referendum on the European Union. Think about the Leave campaign talked about concerns about the funds paid to the EU. That was one of their official main reasons for voting Leave. I'm rather suspicious of the thought that was the campaign manager's own reasons for voting Leave. Similarly, I'm not sure that the economic reasons offered by Remain campaigners really were their own reasons for their vote. And I think the unreciprocated nature of media communication is especially liable to create this unengaged attitude towards viewers and readers, this failure to offer one's own reasons to one's readers. So the kind of objectifying or parametric attitude I've just identified involves offering reasons to one's readers or viewers that aren't one's own in the hope of thereby affecting their action. I think this can't be properly joint action involving communicator and recipient acting as one. And I think it's related to what P.F. Strawson describes as the objective attitude where, there's a different view, but where you basically don't treat people as fully responsible or blameworthy. You see them as sort of objects of treatment. I think those two ideas are related, if perhaps distinct as well. Right, my arguments so far have been largely negative. I've suggested communications in echo chambers that dramatize, that use market language, that objectify or treat others as parametric. These are inconsistent with the joint action in which a democracy should consist. Are there any positive conclusions to draw about what media communication should look like in a proper joint action democracy? And how would these conclusions interact with the individual rights to freedom of expression with which I began? Well, we certainly shouldn't draw the conclusion that shared values are to be favoured independently of the content shared. I think requiring to share in this way might lead us towards fascism or other kinds of fundamentalism. And nor should we assume that any very concrete shared beliefs or values are necessary for joint action. This is actually something I want to think about more. My own hunch is that you can get joint action so long as you've got the right attitude between interactors without much by the way of beliefs being shared. So what I would favour, for what it's worth, and this is just putting forward my own view as something that needs further work, is that appropriate communication of a respectful joint action form has at its heart the idea of address offered to someone conceived second personally as you, rather than as it, her, him, or them. Now, we don't all have to know each other personally to address each other in the second person as you. Think about how an author can address all her readers as you without knowing them. Think about those nice introductions to 19th century novels which start with "Dear Reader." I'm being addressed there as you by an author who died a long time ago. Now, in my view, I can't see someone as part of my group. I can't see them as someone with whom I could form a we involving something like joint intention or joint knowledge without seeing them second personally as you. I think this is necessary if I'm going to invite them to share my perspective in some sense. And I think that kind of invitation to share each other's perspective is essential to the kind of joint action in which the ideal of democracy requires us to live. Okay. I recognise that these remarks about second personal address need far more defence than I can offer here. So does how we should conceive the relations between joint knowledge, intention, and action. I basically put them down as a marker for further work, and I recognise that there are others whose work I could draw on here. Even if my particular claims about the second person seem unmotivated to you, I suggest my earlier negative points can still stand. The joint action case for democracy suggests we should try to abandon spectacular, market, and parametric thinking. And the free speech rights of media corporations shouldn't impede these changes to the norms of the public sphere, given that media corporations' role in enhancing democracy is the main ground for the existence of their rights. I think the weight of individual rights to freedom of expression, where this might include expression that does indeed spectacularize or treat others as parametric, I think is a trickier matter, again, for further work. But I guess my thought is once you start thinking about democracy as joint action, it forces you to think about these things. And in particular, I just want to point out something that I think Shauna Schifrin has stressed, which is the importance of communication as instrumental to good human thinking. I think when we turn to collective agency, collective action, communication is in some sense not just instrumental, it's constitutive of our thinking. Our collective debate just is our deliberation prior to collective action. And as such, the joint action case for democracy suggests we've got to get this collective debate right. We've got to strive for a public sphere that doesn't involve spectacular dramatization, market or parametric thinking. Okay, so my main suggestion then has been that a full diagnosis of problems with contemporary communication requires a focus not only on the epistemic inequality values of democracy, but also democracy as joint action. Now, O'Neill's groundbreaking work on the ethics of the media will, I'd hope, be complemented by a focus on the norms of communication required for people genuinely to come together in the first person plural jointly as we impose laws on ourselves. Now, there's a little bit more I want to say at the end, but just briefly before I get there, I mean, thinking of Jonathan's talk in relation to this, and I can imagine this will probably strike those of you who aren't philosophers very much as a philosopher's talk. You're thinking, wow, okay, he's told us we need to change these norms, we need to strive for this ideal of collective action. How on earth do we get there? He's even told us we can't get there by sort of manipulating people, by giving them reasons that aren't our own reasons. That's rather hard. And I think we'll see in some of the later talks we're getting, such as the talk we're about to hear in a minute, we'll hear other people talking about important changes. Laura, I know, is going to talk about important changes to cultural norms. What should we do to achieve those changes? Is, I think, a really important question that I haven't answered. I'm pleased with Jonathan's thought there might be reasons why that change is going to happen. But what our own role should be, I don't know. As a philosopher, my inclination is to say we should all just continue to engage in argument. That'd be the most respectful way to do it. Continue to engage in argument with everyone as much as we can. That involves treating others in this genuinely joint action way as second personal addressees who together can be brought to share the reasons that motivate the interlocutors. So I want to end by noting that Onora O'Neill's own public participation in her work for the House of Lords or the Equality and Human Rights Commission, for example, this I see as an example of this going on. She puts her own theoretical commitments into practice. She shows exactly the virtues of engagement, sincerity, and thereby commitment to genuinely joint action that I've argued for in this talk. And I'm so pleased that philosophy includes people like Onora O'Neill working in it, because I think it gives us an example of what we should all be striving for. So, thank you. And now I need my water.
We just need to move the podium a little bit for the streaming. Okay. Bear with us.
Was I being misstreamed?
I hope not. A more optimized streaming. That's what we see. Can you see it now? Yeah. Yes.
Okay, here's the water, and here is my timing. Oh, come on. All right. First of all, echoing my predecessors here at the podium, it is a real pleasure and an honor to be invited to honor Onora O'Neill on the occasion of her being awarded the Holberg Prize, and also thank you very, very much to the organizers for putting together such a great event. So I have a few more slides than Rowan, but what he did suggests that pressing next is what I have to do. Great. So the technical side of things is all sorted out. So let me begin the talk with a little anecdote that is really the starting point of the genesis of the talk in conjunction with the invitation to come and speak at the symposium. And the anecdote goes as follows. I think it goes back to a couple of months ago or so. So I was on my way back from a conference, I think, in the US. And so, you know, I got back to London, where I live. I took the Heathrow Express, got to Paddington Station, queued up for the taxi, got into the taxi, communicated the destination, sat down, buckled up, and thought, finally, I'm almost home. I was quite tired, probably jet-lagged. And as I was sitting there in the taxi, I started overhearing a conversation on the radio. There was a talk show going on, and the guests at this talk show were talking about the latest complexities of the UK's divorce from the EU, Brexit. And as I was kind of listening, half listening really, to what was going on the radio, I turned to the right and I saw that the taxi driver was proudly displaying a Union Jack, the British flag, in the taxi. At which point I inferred, I mean, this is not conclusive evidence, but I inferred that he might actually be a Leave supporter. And although I'm not a British citizen, so I didn't have a say in the referendum, the fact that I'm not a British citizen but an Italian citizen already might give you a sense of where my preferences lie in that particular debate. That is, I am not a Leave supporter. I'm very much a Remain supporter. And at that point I thought, oh no, like they're talking politics on the radio. For sure, this taxi driver is going to start getting into a rant about, everything that's bad about the EU. And I don't want to have to listen to it. And so I started basically coming up with very trivial topics of conversation, such as, the weather is not too bad, is it, today? And, what about the latest sports news? Not that I know anything about sports, but I just wanted to keep him busy to avoid the uncomfortable probably conversation, or at any rate being on the receiving end of a view that I very much disagreed with. And I have to say that once I got home, although I was sort of on the one hand relieved that I didn't have to go through that mildly unpleasant experience, on the other hand, I was disappointed with myself. I sort of thought, really, there was something not quite right in my attitude. And you can take this talk as a way of trying to pin down what exactly wasn't right in that kind of attitude, which I suspect is one that I am not the only one to have displayed on some occasions. And so this brings us to the topic of audience responsibility. So let's see whether the Rowan method works. It does. Okay, so in my talk, I am going to place emphasis, as I said, on audience responsibilities. As my fellow panelists who have spoken up to this point have emphasized, and as has been demonstrated by what they said, the ethics of communication tends to focus, on the one hand, on the rights and freedoms of speakers, as well as, more recently, to a large extent also thanks to the work of Onora O'Neill, on their responsibilities in light of the needs of audiences, which need to be taken more seriously in the ethics of communication. But I get the sense that very often the audience is mostly treated as a passive recipient of communication, rather than an agent who is part of the practice of communication, and therefore an agent or a set of agents, given that the audience is plural, who not only has rights and needs, but also responsibilities. And emphasizing audience responsibilities is going to be my task in this talk. So I'm going to be focusing on audience responsibilities. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I think about audience responsibilities in general, and then I'm going to zoom in more specifically on the audience responsibilities of democratic citizens when they are on the receiving end of political communication, which seems more apt given the topic of today's symposium. So I'm going to proceed as follows. There's pretty much one slide per section, so don't get scared if you see many bullet points now. So first of all, I'm going to say something about the context-dependent nature of the ethics of communication, or at least the way in which I conceive of the ethics of or for communication. I'm then going to zoom in on a particular context, as I said, the democratic one, and say something about the role responsibilities of democratic citizens in general in that context. Then say something about the current non-ideal informational and communication environment that characterizes the existing democratic context. And so here, both actually the previous section and this one are going to somewhat echo some of the things that Rowan has said. So he's done a little bit of work for me, which was very helpful. And then finally, bring together citizens' role responsibilities in light of the current informational environment, and then zoom in more specifically on their audience responsibilities. So given the current informational environment and given the role responsibilities of citizens in general within a democracy, what does this imply for their responsibilities qua audience? And then I'll conclude. All right, so first of all, the ethics of communication and context dependence. So I take the ethics of communication, just very briefly, to set out principles that outline the rights and responsibilities of both speakers on the one hand and audiences on the other hand, because as I said, that's some activity on the audience side of the equation too. So audiences have to listen, have to orient their attention, they have to pay attention, they have to process information. All of this is a sort of activity. It's doing something, it's not just sitting there passively in an amoeba-like fashion. So I take this to be more or less the aim of an ethics of communication. And in my talk, I will proceed on the following, which strikes me as a rather plausible hypothesis, namely that the particular norms that govern communication from an ethical point of view are very much context and practice dependent. That is, that the responsibilities as well as freedoms of speakers and audiences depend on the particular roles that they play within the particular practices within which communication takes place. Where the practices in question could be, the practice of the family, the practice of friendship, the practice of teaching within a university, the practice of political decision-making within a democracy. So I am skeptical about the idea that we could have a kind of completely universal, practice-independent set of principles for an ethics of communication, but I think that those principles will partly derive from the role responsibilities of different agents within the particular practices in which they operate. And to operationalize this somewhat abstract idea, let me just give you at least one example. Given time, I'm probably only going to be able to give you one example, that is the example of friendship, and zooming in particularly on the audience responsibilities of a member of a friendship relationship, given that audience responsibilities are my focus here. I won't say anything about speakers' responsibilities, although I think that they are extremely important, but my fellow panelists are going, I guess, have and are going to focus more on them. So imagine the following situation. Imagine that a really good friend of yours comes to visit you and pours her heart out because her husband, she has discovered, has cheated on her. And she expresses her intention to file for divorce. So this is a sort of pretty emotionally charged moment. She tries to tell you what has happened in the midst of sobbing. And you're sitting there, but actually somewhat distracted by either your favorite soap opera on TV or the sports results or whatever that is. I mean, I don't know. Pick your news night. That sounds somewhat more respectable. But, but in that particular case, it would seem to me, as an audience member, in this case just one, but you are on the receiving end, you are under the sea of communication, by virtue of the fact that you are a friend, that you stand in a certain relationship to that person, and that you have certain role responsibilities as part of the practice of friendship, you have a responsibility to listen, and to listen attentively, and to try to understand and empathize with what your friend is going through. And if you fail to do this, her communication will fail because you will not have understood what your friend is going through, and you may very well be blameworthy for it. There seems to me to be something wrong in not fulfilling those role responsibilities. But those role responsibilities percolate, have some implications for your position as, in this case, an audience of or someone on the receiving end of that kind of communication. Note, however, that if the person in question, the person who wants to file for divorce, the very sad one, were to start pouring her heart out to, well, say Onora, for instance, as Onora is walking down the street, maybe trying to reach the House of Lords, it's not obvious to me that Onora would have the same audience-related responsibilities as the friend. Yeah. So this is just a particular illustration of how I think these audience responsibilities are very much dependent on the particular practices within which communication takes place, and on the role responsibilities of the participants in the practice. Here I've used the example of friendship, but as I said, students-teacher relations, employer-employee relations, and so on, I think follow a similar logic. Okay, having said that, let me now zoom in, focus on the context, on the practice that is of interest to me in the context of this talk, that is the democratic practice. So if we want to know what the audience responsibilities of democratic citizens are, based on the particular methodological assumptions that I laid out in the previous slides, then we need to figure out what their role responsibilities, qua democratic citizens, qua participants in the practice of democratic self-government, we could say, are. So what are those role responsibilities? Now, let me start with a not very illuminating answer. Hopefully it'll become a bit more illuminating as I go along. So citizens ought to do their part in the good functioning of a democracy. That seems like a good place to start, but not a very informative one. So what's your role responsibility? Well, you should do your bit. You should do your part in the functioning of a democracy. Okay, but then to figure out what their part is, we need to know what the point and purpose of democracy is. We want to know what the point and purpose of the practice of democracy is, such that we can sort of reverse engineer from that the particular role that citizens need to play in order to enable the good functioning of a democracy. And here, as I said, I'm going to echo some things that Rowan said in his own talk, that it seems to me that the point and purpose of democracy is something like the pursuit of the common good in a way that is consistent with equal respect for citizens, and democracy is regarded as valuable if we have this goal in mind along two dimensions. One dimension has to do with the outcome of democratic procedures. Democracy is set to deliver good outcomes, and I'll explain why that is in a moment, so it has instrumental value. But democracy is also procedurally valuable. There's something in the nature of democratic procedures, which I am broadly understanding as involving free and fair elections, universal suffrage, and broadly majoritarian voting procedures. I realize this is an extremely crude characterization of democracy, but hopefully it will suffice for present purposes. There's something in the very structure of those procedures that expresses equal respect for citizens. This is something that Rowan already mentioned. So slightly more precisely stated. So the value of democracy, as I said, is two-dimensional. On the one hand, democracy has outcome value, helps us deliver good outcomes. Why? Well, there are at least two mechanisms. One has to do with the kind of accountability that democratic leaders have to be subjected to. The people have the power to vote leaders in and out of office, and this, so the argument goes, incentivizes leaders to provide, to some extent at least, good government, because they know that if they will not be responsive to the wishes of the people, they run the risk to be voted out. So accountability is one of the mechanisms through which democracy delivers good outcomes. But also, there are the epistemic arguments in favor of democracy. I mean, these trace back particularly to the Condorcet-Jury theorem. I won't go into much detail in relation to that, but one important thing that I should mention is that these epistemic arguments for democracy tend to only work on the assumption that the citizenry is competent enough. There's various technical definitions of competence, but again, for present purposes, I think that just a general idea of being reasonably competent and well-informed is sufficient. Provided the citizens are reasonably competent and well-informed and some other conditions obtained, then democracy has some epistemic virtue. So again, can help us deliver good outcomes. And then finally, the procedural value of democracy relates to this idea of expressing equal respect for persons. The fact that institutionally, each person has the same right to vote as everyone else is meant to contribute to expressing the fundamental equality of citizens, whereby they and nobody in that society can see him or herself as a second-class citizen. We're all treated as equals, and we can see that we're all being treated as equals because this expression of our equality is obvious, is public, is right there for everyone to see. It's part of the very foundation of our society. Now, if this is arguably, I realize that I'm setting aside the idea of collective action and self-determination, which I think is somewhat trickier, but on the other hand, you know, Rowan has covered it already, so I think, you know, there's a nice division of labor going on here. If these are the reasons why we value democracy, And if a good functioning, well-functioning democracy has to deliver on its outcome and procedural promises, then it looks like, you know, this can't happen unless citizens also do something to contribute to democracy delivering this. And so we can reverse engineer the role responsibilities of citizens within a democracy from what is necessary for democracy to deliver this, which is what we value in a democracy. So here are sort of three role responsibilities of citizens that strike me as rather plausible if we have this account of the value of democracy. One is a participatory responsibility. So you have to be politically active and politically engaged, given that only in so doing can you hold the powerful accountable. And so if you have a completely apathetic citizenry, it looks like the accountability advantage of democracy might not be realized. There's a competence responsibility. You need to be reasonably well informed. Because, as I suggested, some of the best epistemic arguments for democracy presuppose a certain level of competence on the part of the citizenry. And thirdly, there's what one might call a solidarity responsibility. And the idea here is that of course, it's all well and good that institutions enshrine form of political equality in the form of an equal right to vote. But, of course, if the value here is expressive value, then it matters not only what's written in the law, but it also matters what the attitudes of the individuals who populate the institutions are. And a solidaristic attitude towards one's fellow citizens, the idea that we're all in this together, rather than, you know, we are fighting for acquiring power, and the majority is trying to crush the minority. I mean, if you had a political setup of that kind, you know, it's unlikely that an equal right to vote simpliciter would be sufficient to enshrine the idea of equal respect. If anything, it might just look like a facade for what is underlyingly a strongly adversarial, going back to what Rowan said, system, which does not regard everyone as equals. Okay, so what I want to do next is the following. Focus on citizens' role responsibilities, and then think about what these roles responsibilities might imply for the responsibilities of citizens when they are on the receiving end of political communication. So I'm following the same structure that I mentioned in the case of friendship. There are some general role responsibilities of friendship that have implication for the audience responsibilities of friends. I want to do the same for democratic citizens when they are on the receiving end of political communication. But before I can do that, there is one quick last step in the argument, that is, we need to take a look at what the current communication and informational environment is, because what precisely the role responsibilities of citizens as audiences of political communication will be will partly depend on the facts on the ground, the nature of the current informational environment. And here again, you know, I have to thank Rowan because he's done already a little bit of the work for me. So I'm going to be quite quick here. So our non-ideal informational environment, I think that, you know, is part of the general presupposition of what brings us together in this symposium, that we think there's a problem with how communication is working or is not working for democracy at the moment. What are the problems? This is my personal list to be added to Rowan's. I mean, there's some overlap. And what I'm going to emphasize in particular goes back to the work of Constantine that Rowan has again already emphasized. So some of the problems relate to the overabundance of information. One gets completely lost in information today. And so navigating this jungle of information is very hard. The information is becoming increasingly complex. I mean, you know, having been in the UK for many years and having seen what was going on during the Brexit referendum campaign, and it was quite striking to see how the complexity of the whole affair was not even, well, was not particularly emphasized by anyone, it seemed, in the debate, when in fact, you know, the divorce is a very complicated divorce. And the difficulty in establishing the truth of information. You know, again, others, fellow symposiasts have talked about fake news, but how difficult it is to check whether the information and news that one is getting is reliable or not. And finally, there is the polarization and fragmentation, and here's where Sunstein comes in, that is fueled by a certain use of the internet and social media more generally, where you can just wake up in the morning, look at your Facebook feed, which will contain a lot of news that is happily tailored in line with what your network of friends believes, and your network of friends probably has a tendency to believe things that are sufficiently close to what you believe. So you start your day in a good way, in the sense that you look at news the kind of news that you would want to look at, and basically you are no longer forced to have those kinds of conversation and encounters that might be somewhat unpleasant, like the sort of my non-conversation with the taxi driver, which I projected, sort of expected might be somewhat unpleasant. And this leads citizens more and more to live in their own bubble. And this tends to radicalize their conviction, making them more and more, unaware of what other people think, and getting their conviction more and more rooted. Because, look, everyone thinks the way I do, and so, that has to be the obvious thing to believe. It's just that actually that's not the case. 50% of the population doesn't think what you think. It's just that you don't get to see that because you just read your Facebook feed and so on and so forth. They just filter news in a particular way. So this, of course, is very detrimental to democracy, as many of us have pointed out. And while I definitely agree with Onora and many others here that one way of trying to tackle these problems is to regulate the informational environment in a way that makes news more transparent and sources more open, and in a way that perhaps tries to nudge users of, say, the internet, channel them into websites that are not just in line with their views, but also websites that discuss views that they might not particularly agree with. So one of the suggestions that Sansin, for instance, gives is, how about if you have, say, a sort of left-wing newspaper, on the left-wing newspaper strategically place some links to right-wing newspapers so that you kind of try to nudge readers into looking at other views as well. And there's many, many proposals along these lines. And I think that this is, of course, very useful and very important. I'm not suggesting that the communicator-speaker side of communication shouldn't concern us. It should, absolutely. But on the other hand, it also seems to me that even if we regulate things very well, if citizens are not engaged, if citizens don't make an effort as audiences of political communication, if they don't listen, if they don't process, if they don't make an active effort to try and look for views that are not the ones that they are already in agreement with, so if they don't do the opposite of what I did on that taxi, then regulating the informational environment is not going to be enough to get us what we want, that is, the goods that democracy, I suggested, can deliver. And so this brings me to, in a way, the concluding part of my talk, which is about the implication of, on the one hand, the general role responsibilities of democratic citizens, combined with the current informational environment, for the audience responsibilities of citizens specifically. And it seems to me that to discharge their audience responsibilities, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, democratic citizens need to develop an ethos which is permeated by some intellectual virtues. And these are notions that virtue epistemologists have talked about very much. And I'm going to give you my wish list in a second. And again, I mean, I think that probably here the theme of, the idealizing philosopher with her pipe dream, how we're going to get this to happen in practice. But let me at least set out the pipe dream. Seems like a necessary but not sufficient condition to make things change. First of all, the virtue of intellectual curiosity. So, which, of course, would prompt individuals who do have that intellectual curiosity to engage with political communication, go out and seek information, and perhaps seek information that is not just the information that you'd like to hear, but also information that you might dislike. There is patience and focus. I mean, these are sort of well-known intellectual virtues. I've not just come up with them. So patience and focus, so some perseverance in trying to understand what is going on, especially in an increasingly complex world. Fairness and open-mindedness, and particularly open-mindedness, not just focusing on your Facebook feed, but trying to evaluate news in a non-partisan way, for which, by the way, some of the openness and transparency reforms that have been advocated, for instance, by Onora would, of course, be necessary. The audience also needs to be enabled to trust, judge, and evaluate the veracity of different sources of information. Be willing to listen to your opponents and do so respectfully, and do so with a genuinely open mind, thinking that they might have a point in what they say, especially given how complex things are. So the fact that there is disagreement about matters of political debate is no surprise, because, as I said, those issues are extremely complex, and so we should just expect disagreement in light of the complexity. And then intellectual humility, that is trying to acknowledge that complexity and perhaps suspend judgment when you realize that you don't have all the information you need in order to be able to make up your mind. And I want to suggest that trying to develop these intellectual virtues would help citizens in their capacity as audiences to fulfill their broader responsibilities. Why? Because I guess the participatory responsibility, if you think about something like intellectual curiosity, well, that's what gets you out to seek information, to make yourself available as an audience of political communication. Because, if people are trying to communicate to you, but, shut your ears, then, you are not a real audience, you're an intended audience, but you're not listening. Patience, focus, fairness, open-mindedness can help both on the epistemic side of things, of course, because by being exposed to a multiplicity of different views, we can become more competent, but also on the equal respect side of things, in the sense that this kind of engagement, being engaged in that spirit, not hopping on the taxi as I did, oh no, I don't want to listen to another wrong-headed discussion about Brexit. I mean, actually, I didn't know what the taxi driver thought. I guessed, but I didn't really know. And, I thought in that case, I was clearly not behaving in line with the virtues that I'm suggesting one should display. I realize this is my confession. So I'm not here sort of with a particular standing to criticize anyone. This is, in a way, also a critique of my own attitude. And, of course, the big question that I guess many of you might be wondering about, actually the two big questions, and I'll conclude on this one. These ones are the following. The first one, isn't this incredibly demanding? Yeah? Isn't this just like, not even leading academics could be said to necessarily display all of these virtues. We want our citizens to display all of these virtues. How is that possible? So, two things to say in response to this. The first is that I do think that the extent to which one is under what one might call a moral obligation to try and cultivate these virtues also depends on the extent of privilege and power that someone has within society. So I think that a failure to display these virtues is much more problematic and blameworthy if the powerful and privileged fail to display them than if the very underprivileged fail to display them. Ideally, I think everyone should try to display them, but I think that there are obvious mitigating factors there. First thing to say. And the second thing to say is that although I'm based at a political science department, I am not the best place to suggest which methods of social engineering could get us to the kind of ethos that I think would be ideal. But here are two thoughts, in addition to talking to people, which is what Rowan said, and I think is very important. Like you've got to start from somewhere, at least to get the idea out there. But one possibility might be education. And so there are actually projects out there already about educating for intellectual virtues, and also educating for citizens' role responsibilities. I mean, I studied some civic education when I was back in Italy, but that was just all about how the Italian political system works. The sense that I had responsibilities as part of that system, or that I would have them, once I reached a certain age, that didn't seem to be part of what people were telling me. And, on the other hand, everyone told me, you must not steal. And I think that that made a difference to my moral sense. And in addition, also public information campaigns. We had them about not smoking, we had them about drink driving. Why not also about one's role responsibility? So to conclude, it says +07, so I've run out of time. The ethics of communication in the political context, I've argued, should focus on the responsibilities of audiences too. I think changing the informational environment is necessary and regulating it, but probably not sufficient if we want to democracy to deliver its goods. And then the final sort of little excuse, which institutional measures might be introduced to favor the development of an audience ethos centered on the virtues I've sketched, is not something I'm best placed to talk about. I've given you just a quick sketch, but perhaps is a discussion for another day or for later on in the panel. So thank you.
Thank you, audience. It would be very inappropriate for anything to be said from the platform at this point, so let's go and be one another's audience out there near the coffee.
Gentlemen, please return to your seats. We will reconvene now for the second session of the symposium. Bring your coffees, a strawberry or two, make yourselves comfortable, and we will be ready for Onora O'Neill, who will present the last two speakers. Onora, the floor is yours.
Well, it's always the sign of a symposium that is working well when it's very difficult to get people back from the coffee. We move on, and once again with a mixture between people who have looked at this more from the media point of view and more from the philosophical point of view. You have the programs. I won't do introductions. Enough to say that Steve Barnett is somebody whom I have read for many, many years and agreed with him a lot. I won't say always because I might not be right. And Ray Langton, who is in Cambridge and who has just been, which for those of us interested in the ethics of communication is quite significant. She has just been elected to the Knightsbridge Chair of Philosophy, the chair that was held by Henry Sidgwick once upon a time. And so there is a line of thought there. Steve, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Onora. And can I follow others in saying many thanks to the organizers for this invitation, which is an honor. I have to say, extremely intimidated by the idea of having to get slides in 5 days in advance. As someone who traditionally, in fact, I'm still writing what I was going to say as I was listening to the other three excellent presentations. So I've over-slided, if there is such a word. So my apologies in advance, because I didn't have a clue what I was going to say. Can I also say, I'm going to say a little bit, referencing at the end to Onora's work, but I do want to pay tribute right at the beginning. I sort of reached back into my classical education of many years ago, and I remember reading about Plato's philosopher king and the utopian city of Callipolis, and I think here we have a philosopher baroness in the slightly less utopian environment of Westminster and Parliament. But Onora's is a wonderful embodiment of someone who will get stuck in on some of the knottier policy issues around some big philosophical issues. And I've obviously read her work and her books, but actually her contributions in the House of Lords, our second chamber on these issues, have been immense and invaluable, and have been actually very important in pushing this issue forward. I'm conscious that the concept of ethics for communication is pretty vast, so I'm going to be confining myself more specifically to the ethics of journalism, even more narrowly to the ethics of professional journalism, which in itself is a problematic term, which I'm going to address in a minute. I want to stress that I've posed this question within the context not only of an underlying philosophical approach to journalism, but also within the culturally specific context of the UK, where questions about ethical conduct are hotly contested. The Brexit vote, I think, has crystallized an identity issue that I believe has festered for some time in Britain amongst the older generations, in which the country has never really been able to decide whether it is more comfortable looking east or looking west in terms of its cultural values, its economic alliances, its social networks, and its political aspirations. While Nigel Farage and his allies still harbour their fantasy image of a United Kingdom anchored somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, where they can eat cucumber sandwiches, drink warm beer, watch cricket on village greens, and listen to Donald Trump, most Britons have a rather more nuanced and patchwork approach in terms of their cultural values. In journalism, this schizophrenia has traditionally been represented by a public service broadcasting tradition, bequeathed to and well established now throughout Western Europe, and a print journalism tradition which owes more to the yellow press of early 20th century America and Rupert Murdoch's amoral standards honed in Australia. Within the British context, I want to look at who defines professional ethics. Now, as I said, the notion of professionalism is itself problematic. There is still considerable support for the conviction that social and online media have converted all of us into potential journalists. The American academic Robert McChesney, in his book Digital Disconnect, divides the commentariat into digital celebrants and digital skeptics. The celebrants, he says, are swept along by an internet-driven tide of optimism. This is how James Curran characterizes that optimism in his book, Misunderstanding the Internet. He says, the internet would inaugurate a new era of cultural democracy in which the old media leviathans would decay and die. It would rejuvenate democracy, shrink the universe, promote dialogue between nations, and foster global understanding. The celebrant thinking is perhaps best encapsulated by Clay Shirky, but many other digital gurus argue fiercely that the online world has democratized communications through collaboration, through publicness, and through knowledge sharing. Communicative power has fragmented to the masses, and journalism has been wrenched from so-called professionals and devolved to the streets. And now, any bystander with a smartphone and a blog can become an instant journalist, can record events, relay facts, or vent opinions. The very concept of the professional newsroom is a dinosaur analog construct. Now, ranged against these resolute romantics are the digital skeptics, the party poopers of journalism futurology. The skeptics are convinced that the internet is just as capable of promoting ignorance as knowledge, that it promotes a filter bubble of received wisdoms as citizens choose their own comfort zones rather than challenging or dissonant opinions. I refer to Laura's anecdote of the taxi driver. It's an enemy of new discovery, actually fosters loneliness, isolation, and alienation. In journalistic terms, they say, there is no substitute for the professionalism of those who bear witness and who hold power to account according to a set of professional and ethical norms. Now, I confess to always having been a bit of a party pooper and a fully paid up member of the Skeptics Party. Perhaps now more than ever, though, we need established norms of professionalism. In an age where several 100,000 American voters during their presidential election read that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump and that Obama was being indicted by the FBI for wiretapping Trump Towers, we need to know whether these stories are being constructed in a Macedonian living room or have some semblance of truth. Closer to home, we need to know how quickly, when there is news of an explosion, whether it's a bomb or whether, as some reports suggested in the immediate aftermath of the Manchester atrocity, whether it was an exploding generator. When pictures start circulating of those who've been caught in the blast, we need to know whether these are real people rather than photos randomly taken from social media pages. That sort of verification cannot be done by informal bystanders with iPhones. The same is true of referendums and elections. When claims are being made about the levels and impact of immigration, for example, we need reliable sources to sort out the fact from the sensationalism, the propaganda, and the deliberate scaremongering, not just because the accuracy of information underpins the legitimacy of democratic decision-making, but because there are real-life consequences of unqualified misinformation. Just as the Holocaust was built on the lie machines of 1930s Nazi propaganda, so intolerance of refugees is propagated by inaccurate information about public services unable to take the strain of refugee insurgents, and violence against Muslims is fostered by misinformation, sometimes deliberate, about every mosque becoming a haven for extremist radicalization. Recent history, as well as, in my view, common sense, therefore dictates that the case for professional journalism is unanswerable. So, in that case, how do we characterize both the normative roles and the values and ethics by which it should be underpinned? Some of this, of course, has been covered implicitly and explicitly in the previous sessions, but very roughly, crudely, I would say there are 4 ideal type normative roles which journalism plays in democratic societies. First, journalism as the conveyor of relevant, accurate, and undistorted information, an easily accessible means of giving citizens the tools with which to come to an informed view of the world. The second is to provide access to collective rational debate in which citizens can deliberate and develop their own arguments, whether it be letters, columns in the press, phone-in programs, chat rooms on the internet, or online blogs. All media have a potentially ideal role as a neutral public space to assist rational debate and therefore collective opinion formation. This role, of course, has its roots in the Habermasian ideal of the public sphere. The third is the watchdog role, holding government, elected representatives to account, investigating allegations of wrongdoing, corruption, lies, digging up the dirt that powerful interests may be trying to conceal, and finally, the model of media as tribunes of the people. Mass audience publications, programs or online sites can seek to synthesize the public's collective view and then campaign as they see it or as they claim on the public's behalf. Now, professional journalism in pursuit of those norms is traditionally circumscribed by codes of editorial practice which define the boundaries of ethical conduct. In the UK, Ofcom lays down rules for broadcasters, licensed broadcasters, including, as of April this year, the BBC. The press, including its online platforms, has historically developed its own editorial codes. The most recent incarnation, established and controlled by the major national publishers, of course, is the so-called Independent Press Standards Organization, of which more in a moment. And of course, Jonathan's Impress has been formally recognized both as independent and effective. In addition, the National Union of Journalists has its own ethical code of conduct involving 12 principles to which members are expected to adhere. These codes, all in various degrees of detail, lay down appropriate codes for publishers and journalists. Now, I don't want to enumerate them here in detail, but they provide guidance for ethical behavior on issues such as accuracy, privacy and intrusion into grief, including use of photography, harassment and persistent pursuit of interviewees, dealing with children, reporting of suicide, the use of subterfuge, hidden filming and entrapment, the acquisition and use of private information, including information taken from social media sites, all underpinned by exceptions through public interest justifications. Now, I'm going to return in a minute to that central issue of the definition of the public interest, because it lies at the heart of debates, I think, about ethics and journalistic professionalism. But I first want to draw attention to the contrast in regulatory structures between broadcast and print media in the UK in ensuring implementation of these largely consensual editorial ethical codes. Broadcasters are obliged, as part of their license, to abide by the codes which are laid down by Ofcom. Ofcom has the power to order on-screen corrections for code breaches, to determine the timing and wording of such corrections, to levy fines for serious breaches, and ultimately, for serious and persistent breaches, to revoke the license to broadcast. The result has been independent journalism over several decades of the highest standard, in pursuit of all the normative roles which I've just outlined: investigations, truth-telling, a trusted forum for opinion sharing, and robust interrogation, which holds power to account, have all been a regular feature of Britain's broadcast journalism. So what about the print media? Some of its journalism is brilliant, much of it isn't. I don't intend to rehearse the catalogue of abuse and wrongdoing that emerged during the Leveson inquiry, which Jonathan alluded to 5 years ago, but I want to emphasize a central issue which is often misunderstood. That inquiry was not just centered on criminal phone hacking, but on the far more wide-ranging culture, practice, and ethics of the press. And what we heard was a litany of failure which went way beyond breaches of the criminal law. We heard about intrusions into private grief, bullying and intimidation, intrusions into privacy, surveillance of MPs and the lawyers of victims by newspapers, theft of confidential data, people's private medical, financial, police, and driving records were stolen, data mining described as being on an industrial scale by an official investigation by the Information Commissioner, and gratuitous inaccuracies to fit the story of those that the newspapers believed were guilty. Some of this evidence was frankly beyond belief, shocking and repeated revelations of malicious distortion, vindictive bullying, and gross intrusions, which defied any kind of editorial code. It amounted to a flagrant and systematic disregard for the editor's code, regularly flouted by newspapers and with impunity. Now, I wanted to highlight in particular the issue of privacy as a means of trying to calibrate more accurately the role of ethics in journalistic decision-making. And I first want to illustrate the editorial mindset with a notorious example from last year, which became known as the celebrity threesome case. The background was this. In January 2016, The Sun on Sunday wanted to publish an article about an extramarital affair involving a well-known entertainer who it was alleged had a three-way sexual encounter with two other individuals 6 years earlier. One of those individuals, which happens quite often, had come to the paper with the story and was prepared to give intimate details in return for a large payment. The celebrity who was implicated was married, and he and his partner had young children. He was known in court only as PJS, not the initials for his real name, to retain his anonymity. One of the gaudier details of this so-called three-in-a-bed scenario was that it involved bathing in olive oil, a little detail which will become clear in terms of why it's relevant in a moment. PJS was informed of this impending story, applied for an injunction to prevent publication, was refused by the Court of First Instance, but was then granted an injunction by the Court of Appeal. The newspaper, in opposing the injunction, argued vehemently that PJS had put many details of his marriage into the public domain and that there was a public interest in publishing the details of his sexual exploits with others. The paper appealed to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. Last May, the Supreme Court heard the case and decided by, the 5 Supreme Court judges decided by 4 votes to 1 to uphold the injunction, and the names of the protagonists remain unpublished by the press to this day. The press reaction to that verdict was furious, if predictable, outrage. The Daily Mail headline when the Court of Appeal overturned the initial injunction was "Why the Law is an Ass." And when the Supreme Court decision came out, this was the Sun's verdict, and hence the little detail about the bath of olive oil. So here were their justifications. According to the Mail, it is your right to know. The Court of Appeal ruling banning British press from naming cheating married celebrity is draconian and unfair to the public. These are my italics, by the way. And The Sun. It is palpably absurd to keep our readers from seeing information available to billions online. Judges should rule on the law, not impose their snooty prejudices about tabloid stories they find prurient. It's not their call to decide what's in the public interest or whether that differs from what the public is interested in. So this was the rationalization by editors based on arguments around free speech and transparency in the public interest. In other words, their position is vindicated by reference to the public's appetite for those kinds of stories. It is a familiar populist libertarian argument that we have always liked: gossip, scandal, crime stories. It was famously immortalized by Ronald Reagan's chairman of the Federal Communications Committee, Mark Fowler, with the words, "The public's interest defines the public interest." And this, they said, is why the News of the World was the second biggest selling newspaper in Europe before its closure. In a nutshell, say the editors, our ethics of journalism reflects the public's ethics of journalism. Now, 5 years ago, for the British Journalism Review, where I'm on the editorial board, I tested that proposition with some empirical research into public attitudes, with some interesting results. So I want to spend a few minutes going through the questions that were asked and the responses from the general public. This was following standard opinion polling techniques, asking a representative sample of the population. This was the question that we asked them. Here are a number of possible newspaper stories. Please tell me for each story whether the paper should or should not publish the story. And here were the responses that respondents were offered. The story is definitely in the public interest and should be published. Not necessarily in the public interest, but should nevertheless be published. The story is a private matter and should not be published, and don't know. So there are essentially two options for saying the story should be published, one for not being published. Those 8 stories were presented in random order, and I'm going to give you the responses in order of whether they supported publication or not. So this was the first story. Foods sold by a major supermarket have been contaminated with bacteria. So, how did people respond to that? Well, actually fairly predictably. A huge proportion said this was in the public interest and should certainly be published. Second story. A High Court judge has large investments in foreign companies linked to the illegal drugs trade. And again, a very large majority in favor of publication. Third story. A school teacher has been passing on exam questions to students to help their GCSE grades. These are the exams that we take at 16. Slightly less, but still a large majority in favor of publication. Fourth story. A company testing medicines is suspected of cruelty towards animals. And of course, we are very keen on our animals in the UK, so this was very much regarded as being in the public interest. But now it gets interesting. So this was the fifth story. A well-known England footballer who is married with young children is having an affair. The very kind of story that the newspapers regard as absolutely their right to publish in the public interest. And I kind of assumed that maybe there would be a sort of 50-50 split, possibly, certainly in terms of the two responses combined, a majority in favor of publication. That was the response. A clear majority actually regarding this as that it shouldn't be published, even if it was not necessarily in the public interest. The sixth story. A leading politician's daughter is found drunk in public. Again, the kind of story which the British press would regard as slap bang in the middle of a public interest justification, disagreed by general members of the public. Seventh story, a leading member of a pop group has had cosmetic surgery to change the shape of her face, the kind of story that you tend to get on the back of celebrity programs. Again, the majority, 2/3 against publication. And finally, a contestant on Britain's Got Talent who's reached the final once tried to commit suicide, and here you have a very large majority against publication. So, what do we conclude? For most people in the UK, the journalistic imperative of telling truth to power does not entail exposing the details of infidelity or revealing the kinds of salacious material which are a routine element of kiss and tell stories. So the editorial justifications that we've heard from the press are wrong. Nor are they supported by grassroots journalists, and this is important. At the Leveson inquiry, the National Union of Journalists General Secretary quoted anonymous journalists who said they were being forced to follow editorial directions. They weren't prepared to give their names for fear of reprisals. Bullying has been endemic in some of these newsrooms. So why is there such a disconnect between ethical values espoused by the public and journalists and those dictated by some newsrooms? And here I think we have to look at the historical and economic structural factors going back some time. First of all, we have a national newspaper tradition in the UK, which goes back 150 years, a small geographical area where distribution lines are relatively easy from a centralized printing process, often based in London. This compares to most European countries whose traditions are much more regionally based. Ferocious competition at this national level between still 9 hard copy print titles, 10 if you include online. Unique, possibly in the world with the exception of Japan. A tabloid tradition going back decades, which has often operated at the margins of journalistic ethics. Foot-in-the-door techniques, apologetic in terms of the way in which they approach their subjects. And some of the biographies of former Fleet Street editors are pretty graphic in some of the tales that they tell. The distinguished British playwright Tom Stoppard, a fierce free speech advocate, distinguished between what he called St. George journalism and jackal journalism. This is what he said. The national press which emerged from the Leveson inquiry presented a split personality, part St. George, part jackal, which is not actually journalism, but a delinquency which happened to be practiced by journalists. I think this split personality is best diagnosed in classical sociological terms as a struggle between structure and agency. The inculcation of ethical and professional values which reflect universal values on the one hand versus a newsroom culture and a top-down editorial imperatives dictated by publishers on the other. What we've struggled to find in the UK is a structural solution founded on those ethical values which are naturally embraced by the public and by most journalists. And that is what the Leveson proposals in 2012 were designed to achieve. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail about those proposals, but the bottom criteria of this slide, I think, is the encapsulation of the proposed system. Effective, independent, sustainable, and not subject to the whims of commercial and proprietorial imperatives. Our broadcasting environment provides empirical evidence that journalistic freedom is not impaired by an effective regulator with teeth, but this structural solution for the press was founded also on a philosophical argument most eloquently advanced by Onora in her 2002 Wreath Lectures, when she distinguished between individual free speech and corporate free speech. Prophetically, and remember this was 15 years ago when Onora was writing this, she warned that we were perilously close to a world in which media conglomerates act as if they too had unrestricted rights of free expression. Onora then elaborated on this theme in a lecture in November 2011 when she distinguished between individual self-expression and the speech of powerful organizations. The communication of the powerful can shape and influence, improve and damage others' lives, and in democracies we've long since taken steps to regulate the communication of the most powerful organizations. Crucially, she drew a distinction between regulating media content, which was not acceptable, and regulating media process, which was both acceptable and desirable as a means of ensuring transparency for audiences as well as accountability of the powerful. Regulating the process by which fairness, accuracy, respect for privacy, redress for journalistic malpractice are properly implemented by the press need entail no constraint on newspapers or publishers' freedom to publish. It's become horribly apparent over the last 20 years that the ethical values determined through culture, history, and tradition by publishers are out of kilter with the rest, but it is their definition, their corporate vision, which still dictates British print journalism culture. And that is why, when their vision is threatened by a structural solution designed to embrace a consensual approach to ethical journalism, this is the kind of campaign which Britain's press elite chooses to launch. So, I will conclude now. Onora, with I think, another tribute to Onora, if you'll forgive me, who has been a stalwart and, in my view, inspirational leader of change. I have to say that, unfortunately, so far, it is the antediluvians and the dinosaurs of the British press who still hold the floor. I must finish with one anecdote, also taken from Tom Stoppard, because Onora opened her Reuters lecture that I talked about with a famous quote from Stoppard, which is quoted many times after the phone hacking scandal, from his play called Night and Day, where one of the characters says, "I'm with you on the free press, it's the newspapers I can't stand." For today's purposes, I think there's a rather better line later in the same play. A certain President Magiba of the fictional African Republic Kambawi is interrogating a veteran British tabloid reporter, a man called Dick Wagner, who's come to report on his country. And he asked Wagner, "Do you know what I mean by a relatively free press, Mr. Wagner?" "Not exactly, no, sir," says Wagner. "I mean," says the president, "a free press which is edited by one of my relatives." Now, we don't have many publications in Britain which are edited by the relatives of proprietors, but they're all appointed by proprietors, or editors are appointed by proprietors who have very clear ideas, not just about the editorial direction of their publications, but also their operating culture. And it was pretty clear, not just before Leveson, but even since, that newsroom cultures in many of those organizations pay scant attention to the norms of appropriate journalistic ethics that are both implicit and explicit in the codes of conduct which they themselves have drawn up and purport to follow. For that to change will require a structural solution along the lines of Leveson, firmly cemented by an approach to journalism rooted in public and journalist approach to ethics rather than editors and proprietors. Thank you.
Now we go back to philosophy for the last word, and I'll ask Ray Langton to speak to us.
Where do I plug it in? Thank you very much. It's a tremendous privilege to be here. It's a tremendous privilege to be here at a time to celebrate Onora's incredibly powerful work on the ethics of communication, and a privilege to be here in a place with an organization that recognizes that, and with people who have brought out so many different aspects of this from the academy and from the real world, where it makes all the difference. My title is Post-Truth as Post-Democracy. And some of you may know that post-truth was the word of the year for the OED, for the Oxford English Dictionary in 2016. And I believe that it first was floated in 1992 in an essay by Steve Tezish in The Nation, the Nation magazine. He was reflecting at that time on the Iran-Contra scandal and the Persian Gulf War, and he said, we, as a free people, have freely decided that we want to live in some post-truth world. What I want to say today is that to the extent that we are living in a post-truth world, we are not free, and we are not a democracy. So there's something inherently contradictory in that possibility that Steve Tesic was countenancing. In talking about this, I'm going to be taking up some themes from Onora's work, which have been a big influence on me as well as many others here. One is that the problem that we face today is not a lack of trust so much as a lack of trustworthiness. Another hugely important thing, which goes far beyond the ethics of communication, is the relationship between duties and rights, and how talk of rights without any talk about whose duty it is to uphold that right, and how there might be duties which are not captured by rights at all. This is enormously an important and neglected topic in political philosophy, whose implications for free speech and communicative ethics are only just being seen. I'm going to take up the role of background enabling conditions, which mean, and that's what we've been hearing today already, that free speech is not hands-off. Free speech is not something you have when you haven't got someone about to clap you in jail. It's not only that, and this is a theme in Jonathan's work, it's not just a negative state hands-off. It's about having a certain power, having a certain capacity, and that takes enabling conditions. And those enabling conditions include the speech practices of organizations that do not themselves have a right to free speech, namely the media. This is another theme from Onora's work that we've been looking at today. And I want to talk about getting ethics back into justice, which is going to be the theme of her lecture this afternoon. That quotation, we as a free people have freely decided that we want to live in some post-truth world. Now just imagine somebody says, well, what I say is okay because I am living in a post-truth world. And so I don't need to, why are they saying that? Well, I don't need to give evidence, I don't need to support it, it's not in the business of truth. I am living in a post-truth world. Imagine someone uttering that. Is what they're uttering true? Of course, they are claiming that it's true. So you cannot, in fact, claim to be living in a post-truth world and at the same time be claiming something that has even a chance of being correct. There's a paradox about the whole thing. So in practice, we see post-truth being used not in the first personal case, oh, it's okay, I don't have to live up to any norms because I'm living in a post-truth world. Really, we tend to find it used in the third person case where we accuse other people of living in a post-truth world. And there's a good reason for that, because the first personal use is paradoxical. It also, and this brings me to my main theme, is bringing out something very deep about the connection between what we can come to know and what we can come to choose. Now, when we have this idea that we as a free people have freely decided we want to live in some post-truth world, the thought is, if we're a democracy, we can choose whatever we like, and one of the things we might want to choose is the rejection of truth. That is impossible, not only because it's impossible to say, because it's paradoxical, it's also impossible because democracy depends on a certain commitment to truth. That's been in the background of what many people we've been hearing today have been saying. What I want to do, because I want to anticipate the connection with ethics that we'll be hearing more about this afternoon from Onora, I want to say how this commitment to truth that is at the basis of democracy has its roots in a certain ethical perspective. So one of the things that Onora and I have in common also, in addition to our interest in media ethics, is also an interest in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And I think that was among the first things we ever talked about many years ago. So here is a big theme in Kant. Immanuel Kant said that when you don't know what you're doing, you're not choosing what you do. So there's a sense in which you're not acting as a full agent. He didn't put it in quite those terms, but anyone who's read the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals knows that his famous example of a lying promise, where he says, suppose somebody promises to pay you back your £50, whatever they were, they weren't pounds, next week, and this is a lying promise. And you lend them the £50, so you think. Kant says this is a wrong at many levels. It's a wrong, first of all, because it is at odds with what he called the principle of humanity. The principle of humanity says we need to treat each other as agents, as he, in his jargon, ends in themselves. We need to treat each other as agents who are authors of our action. And if you feed someone something fake that relates to what they're going to do, you stop them from choosing what they're doing. This is a very powerful connection between epistemic agency and practical agency, which is there in the philosophy of Kant, and we find it in a very everyday place over in medical ethics, in the idea that when your doctor says to you, oh, you're just going in for a small biopsy, and you come out of the operation with an amputation. Nobody mentioned Brexit in this connection, please. You did not choose to do that. And then when the doctor waves your document of informed consent in front of you, you can say, I'm sorry, an amputation was not what I consented to. So Onora has written on this topic too, the relationship between epistemic agency and self-determination, also a theme in Rowan's talk earlier today, that agency involves a certain minimal amount of knowledge. Now, where in a democracy do we have our most basic expression of agency? In voting. So voting is to democracy as informed consent is to your relationship with your doctor. To the extent that it is built on lies, you are not choosing what you do. There's a whole lot else that's wrong with the picture too. All sorts of things about the social relationship have gone wrong as well. And that's some of the things that Laura was talking about this morning. We're touching on those. So the first thing that's wrong is that democracy demands truth because you need to know the truth if you're going to be able to even vote. It's not even going to count as a vote if you have no clue what you're doing. So this relates then to many things in the background that were mentioned as ideals of democracy, whether there needs to be basic epistemic competence, whether there's equality, or whether if some people are being fed lies and some people aren't being fed lies, equality is going to be undermined, and also whether we are doing things together when we are democratic citizens choosing together who will govern us. So there's a parallel between the self-determination of a democracy and all of us in it together, and the self-determination of an agent, whether they're visiting their doctor. I could have gone into many other examples, and the other place where deceit undermines agency that is very well known to us all is in personal relationships, especially sexual relationships. When they're built on profound lies, sexual consent is undermined. So this is a very familiar point that lies can undermine agency. The other Kantian theme is drawn from his other principle, not the principle of humanity, but the principle of universalizability. The thought is, when lies are everywhere, lies are nowhere, because communication itself breaks down. That's the basic thought behind Kant's principle of universalizability that says, when you choose to do something, you need to think to yourself, could this be done by everyone, everywhere. That's a kind of impartiality requirement, a universalizability requirement, and whatever you think of its merits, it's a very good thought experiment for getting a handle on the dependence of practices on individual behavior. A familiar example, this time not from medicine, but from fairy tales. So we had the troll under the bridge this morning from Jonathan, the story of the boy who cried wolf. So the story of the boy who cried wolf is so well known. The boy falsely cried wolf over and over again and destroyed his own power of crying wolf by crying it far too often. Now, what we have in a community of speakers is the possibility of speech powers being undermined, sometimes by speakers themselves, like the boy, sometimes by other speakers who destroy their credibility. So I've made a study of certain forms of hate speech. And one thing that's very interesting about hate speech is that it can undermine credibility of speakers. So Nazi propaganda was organized around this image of the poisonous toadstool, der Giftpilz, which undermined the credibility of your Jewish neighbors who look exactly like all the healthy ones, only you mustn't trust them because they're deadly poison. So what this means is that certain speech powers can be undermined by the speech of others. And that relates to two things. The speech powers of individuals who can be silenced by the hateful speech or the speech that undermines credibility. And it also relates to the practice in general, where if things get completely out of control, you have a situation where if fake news is everywhere, news is nowhere, and fake news is nowhere either. So the thought is that certain practices depend on a certain minimal participation in the practice, and if it gets completely out of control, the practice itself is going to die out. So there are two Kantian thoughts, that agency is undermined by lies, and also that practices of communication themselves are undermined by lies. Now, these are constitutive ethical points. There are also in the background normative ethical points, which is that, even if the practice wasn't going to break down and even if agency wasn't undermined, there are moral requirements on our speech which go beyond these constitutive points. And I think that we've been partly hearing the political side of those from people this morning. So I've talked about the themes, some of the themes from Onora I'm going to be taking up. I've talked about the Kantian themes because we have this enthusiasm in common. Now, I'm also going to talk briefly about Mill, because Mill is somebody whose name is often taken in vain in connection with debates about free speech, which is a tremendous irony because Mill was the most eloquent defender of free speech, and I agree with many, many things he said. In fact, I think I agree with more of what Mill said than Onora does, but we can, maybe I'll check later. One of the things that Mill said is hugely important. One of the things he did was basically ask, what is the point of free speech? Now, just asking the question is progress, because asking the question means I am not just going to use free speech as a mantra to shut people up. I'm going to ask, what is the point of it? And his answer is a very famous answer. It's sometimes known as the argument from truth, but I want to call it the argument from knowledge. Well, we can call it the argument from truth. 4 reasons that free speech helps truth. It's necessary because the opinion that we might otherwise rule out might be itself true. That opinion may, for all we know, be true. Second, it may contain at least a portion of the truth, and it's only by the clash of adverse opinions that the remainder has any chance of being supplied. Third, unless it's vigorously contested, it's going to be held in the manner of a prejudice without comprehension of its rational grounds. And fourth, it's going to end up just a formal profession, inefficacious for good. Now, it is worth keeping in mind that he especially, I think, had religious freedom of opinion in mind here. So it's worth letting everyone express their views, their opinions. And for all we know, the opinions that are being expressed may themselves be true, even if they're false. The clash of adversarial opinions, it might help us get further along. Now, it's a story not just about truth, but about knowledge. And it's hugely important that what's underlying it is an instinct that the enemy is prejudice. The enemy is not just falsehood, but prejudice, a kind of unthinking prejudice. He says that if the true opinion abides as a prejudice, a belief independent and proof against argument, this is not knowing the truth. Truth thus held is but one superstition the more, accidentally clinging to the words which enunciate a truth. Now, that's the argument from truth. There are three other things to say briefly about Mill. One is he had a very nuanced and context-sensitive view about speech acts that are involved in the expression of our opinions. So, to take his famous case, the opinion that the corn dealers are the starvers of the poor should be unmolested when it's circulated through the press, but it may incur just punishment when it's delivered to an excited mob assembled by the house of a corn dealer. This passage is often quoted to support Mill's endorsement of a harm principle as applied to speech itself. I prefer to see it as a nuanced understanding of the nature of certain speech acts. So it's not simply that some speech acts are harmful and they should be banned. It's rather that some speech acts acquire a different kind of force when they're in a different context, and that force could be, in this case, incitement, or it could be legitimating norms for this audience rather than for that audience. So there's an audience sensitivity to the nature of speech. This touches on the issues that Laura was raising about the responsibilities of hearers as well as speakers. There's an audience sensitivity, which means that what the speech act is itself varies with the context. The huge problem for us all is, of course, that Mill's neat distinction between circulating an image in the press and yelling it in front of the angry mob, that distinction is really hard to maintain, especially when circulating it in the press can then swiftly be effectively waving it in front of an angry mob. So that's a hard problem. Another thing to say about Mill is that he wanted to include other hearers. He said that truth has no chance, but in proportion as every side of it, every opinion which embodies even a fraction of the truth, not only finds advocates, but is so advocated as to be listened to. That's a bit of Mill that people never remember, and it involves the obligations of listeners. Which Laura was raising. It involves having contexts where speech can be heard, and it means that when certain groups are silenced by structural issues, not just by the state, that itself is an infringement on the values that are at the heart of free speech. Now, there's much more to say about Mill, but I'm not going to say it here. I'm just going to throw out one thought here, which is basically taking up something that Laura said. Laura said, it's possible when you think about the question, what is the point of free speech and what is the point of democracy, it's possible when you get clear on what its point is to then say, well, what would it need for us to achieve that point? In other words, to reverse engineer the argument you've just heard. So Mill says, when these conditions are in play, we are going to get knowledge. And that's really good because it involves the contribution of choice, the doing things together, what democracy needs. Now, when these conditions are in play, if this is the goal, and these are the conditions, but we find the conditions don't quite get us to the goal, then what's clear is we need those conditions plus whatever else is needed to get us to those goals. That's what I take Laura to mean when she talks about reverse engineering arguments for free speech. This is what we need to get this wonderful thing. This, we find out empirically, is not going to get us quite that wonderful thing. What else does it take? And norms relating to the press and the norms that are going to enable the press in its function of helping citizens speak truth to power, hold the government accountable, understand what it is they're doing so that they don't think they're going in for a biopsy and they're going in for an amputation. You know, all of this, if something more is needed, then we have a free speech argument for that something more. So what I'm saying is not only is it a matter of free speech sometimes coming into conflict with other democratic values such as equality, free speech itself demands exactly the sorts of communicative norms that we are talking about. So I now want to say one thing in the remaining time. Does this mean I've got the number of minutes left, it says? Okay, good. Okay. I want to say one more thing about communicative ethics, which takes up an idea that we heard Onora express this morning, which was about duties. We hear a lot about rights of free speech. We don't hear much about duties of either hearers or speakers. Now, I've said that Mill's argument leads to a truth-oriented motivation for free speech. That doesn't mean only utter sentences that are true. That would be too hard for any of us. It does mean that truth-oriented speech needs certain norms to apply to it. We need conditions under which truth can flourish, and what Mill is looking for is the conditions under which free speech can flourish. Now, what then are the obligations on speakers? Motivated partly by these considerations, but more by some other, in fact, somewhat Kantian considerations, the legal theorist Shona Shifrin has argued that there is no free speech right to tell lies. In other words, she interprets the ethics of free speech to require sincere speech. It doesn't necessarily require truthful speech, but it requires sincere speech. So, speech whose point is simply the making of money, without constraints of sincerity, without constraints of truth, without constraints of evidence, whatever, it might have many merits, including making money for the shareholders, but also including knowledge, including entertainment. It might have many merits, but it doesn't have the merits that belong to it qua exercise of free speech. It might have some other merits. So, but we can't just simply wrap ourselves in the flag of the First Amendment, so she says, as someone who's been used to arguing with Harvard First Amendment lawyers. Sorry. Okay, so I want to agree in part with this thought that free speech doesn't protect a right to lie. My motives being, in part, the choice-oriented Kantian thought that we need to determine ourselves what the government is going to be. We need to be able to hold the government accountable, and also in part because the very practices of communication are necessary for democracy. By the way, they're also necessary for us as human beings. I missed out this crucial part of Mill, where he said freedom of opinion and freedom of expression of opinion is necessary for the well-being of humanity. So this is in addition to what we need for democracy. Even if we were in a tyranny, we would need free speech for our well-being. So I want to draw on some thoughts. No, let me just put this out front. Shona Schifrin has got into a lot of trouble for saying free speech does not protect a right to lie. I think the criticisms are mistaken of what she's saying, and I want to add to what she says that free speech does not protect a right to utter backdoor lies. So I'm introducing to you a new idea, an idea of backdoor lies. Now, a backdoor lie is just like a lie, except it's not explicitly asserted. I'm really interested in this because I'm not just I don't just work in ethics, I also work in philosophy of language. And one of the things I found absolutely fascinating when I testified to the Leveson inquiry was reading the testimony of many, many other groups who were talking not only about the violations of privacy norms, not only the invasion into one's own private life that is hugely important, and I'm not touching on that, even though it is hugely important, but also the testimony of groups who said that media speech, it was often cast as media speech is undermining equality, and I wanted to say it's actually undermining free speech as well. How was it undermining equality? Well, testimony from refugee groups, testimony from women's groups talked about how certain forms of speech was racist or sexist. What did they mean by that? I want to suggest that they meant that certain forms of speech were telling certain backdoor lies about certain groups. I'm not sure if I'm going to get this right, but here's one from the infamous Swan Bake episode, infamous in Britain. So Swan Bake became the label for a scandal in the press where it had turned out, where one of the tabloids had a headline that went something like this: "Asylum seekers barbecue the Queen's swans." Okay, so just think about that headline for a minute. I'm really interested in that headline. One really interesting thing about headlines is that you don't need quantifiers in them. Quantifiers are words like all Fs are G, or most Fs are G, or some Fs are G. We don't know how many. We just have this noun at the beginning: asylum seekers, unquantified. Asylum seekers barbecue the Queen's swans. Now think of that as a philosopher of language, and I think of that, I think, wow, asylum seekers, I noticed the no quantification, how many? Who knows? Asylum seekers are being used as a label, as a sort of supposedly neutral label, but edging into a generic. It's not quite a generic, it's because the thing about headlines is that they can purport to be true on the basis of just one example. Suppose just one asylum seeker had barbecued just one of the Queen's swans. It would have been okay to report that as asylum seekers barbecue the Queen's swans. So there's something interesting about headline speak there. Asylum seekers barbecue, so the asylum seekers, it edges into generics. What's a generic? A generic is an unquantified general statement that philosophers of language and psychologists have been studying recently because they're a tremendously interesting source of stereotyping thinking and stereotyping behavior. You think, oh, this labels a kind. And then you think, oh, this labels a kind that most things coming under that kind belong to. So it becomes a statistical generalization. Most asylum seekers barbecue the Queen's swans. And then it becomes sort of metaphysical, reifying. Oh, they are the sort of people who would do that. Then, of course, you've got funny little things like the Queen's swans. Talk about an obscure bit of patriotism. How many people, of course, everyone knows that to be a true British patriot, you have to know that all the swans in Britain belong to the Queen. Actually, they don't. I think some belong to St. John's College by some complicated arrangement that I don't understand. Okay, so there is a backdoor speech act in that headline. By the way, that headline was also a lie, a straight-out, old-fashioned lie. Not one asylum seeker had barbecued one of the Queen's swans. Okay, there was some vague story. It never ended up with a single case. What I'm saying is, even if there had been a single case, there would be a backdoor lie in the use of generics. Backdoor lies are familiar to us. Paul Grice, the philosopher of language, talked about conversational implicatures. The philosophy professor whose letter of reference says, well, Ray Langton has excellent handwriting. Okay, so if that's what his letter of reference says of me, then he has damned me. So even though he said something nice. So conversational implicatures can be backdoor lies. Clinton, when he said, there is no sexual relationship, that was a backdoor lie, even though it was an explicit truth, because there was a sexual relationship. The president, this is one from last week, the president believes the climate's changing. It's always changing. Great. That is not being pinned down on whether the climate is changing as a result of human contribution. Another one, that's just locker room talk. Locker room talk, used of a very famous utterance, which I'm not even going to repeat in this distinguished company. That's just locker room talk. Locker room talk is being used as a referring expression, like asylum seekers, like the Queen's swans. When there's a referring expression, you think there's a point to having a label for this kind of thing, and that's why, not very much, but a few athletes got up and said, what do you mean? What do you mean locker room talk? They were trying to block the presupposition that locker room talk labeled a social norm where it is okay to talk that way, for instance, in men's locker rooms by the sports field. Okay, so backdoor speech acts are also can be backdoor lies. And by the way, this is true whether or not they're assertions. To take the most famous case from the history of lies, oops, that red means I'm over time. Is that right? St. Athanasius famously, cleverly said, when he was escaping from his enemies, they said, where is St. Athanasius? He said, in disguise, he is not far from here. And everyone says, what a clever response. It was a backdoor lie because it implicated that he was not Athanasius. And by the way, it would have been a backdoor lie if it had been a question, who's Athanasius? Or if it had been a command, go upstream if you want to find Athanasius. There are backdoor lies all over the place, and I want to say that our duties to speak the truth include a duty to speak the truth in what we say through the back door, as well as what we say explicitly. I am out of time. I just want to say that some of these conclusions, as you will hear, anticipate the lecture we'll hear from Onora this afternoon, that there can be no justice without ethics, and this applies to free speech as to everything else. Thank you.
We now have a on the podium to get all the speakers up here and for the final panel discussion. So bear with us just a moment.
Yes, the backdoor lie is a very good one. I'd forgotten about St. Anthony.
should be all set. For those of you who were not here this morning, in addition to Professor Onora O'Neill at my far, it must be your right, and my left, the first speaker is Professor journalist and literary scholar in his past, Jonathan Heawood. It is professor at the University of Stirling, Rowan Cruft. Then it is Italian-born, residing in London, associate professor at the London School of Economics, Laura Valentini. And then the last two speakers who spoke in this last session, number 2, professor at the University of Westminster, Stephen Barnett, and then lastly, professor of philosophy, Ray Langton. Now, we're going to start this by just letting Onora O'Neill perhaps comment a little bit on what has transpired this morning and this afternoon, because we're after 12. And we will take it from there.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, it's been, for me, a very interesting morning with broad reflections and very apt illustrative detail. I'm going to work backwards and start with something that Ray introduced to the debate, which I think is astonishingly important for us. It is the distinction between speech acts and speech content. And that focus reveals to us a great deal about what is going on when we speak, when we write, when we publish, and the rest of it. One of the things I think implicitly came out from what she said is we make a mistake if we think that the regulation of speech, or indeed speech ethics, should be about the content. The content, of course, is interesting, but it is the act by which we convey it. And I find it interesting that in the past, when people have used censorship, they have often tried to censor specific sorts of content. So that was the point of blasphemy laws, or anti-pornography, anti-obscenity laws, and so on. I believe that we were already clear in the 18th century why it doesn't work. And if you think about Montesquieu's great work, the Persian Letters, Les Lettres Persanes, he is talking, of course, about Persia, but he is actually talking what would not be permitted to say about France. Everybody reading it knew that he was talking about France. And the regulation of content doesn't work. And I believe the censors of the last century have repeatedly discovered that. So, for example, if you think of I waved to my daughter-in-law who was from Moscow. If you think about the skill with which people in the former Soviet Union could speak about forbidden matters, using terminology that everybody understood, but that might not get you into trouble. And we've all seen examples like that again and again. So the question that we have to address, I believe, is about Speech Act. So thank you very much for bringing that up front, Ray. Steve gave us a wonderful rundown about what has actually been going on in the UK. Now, you may all have wondered, how did we end up with 5 people who work in the UK? They have had very international careers. Now, part of it is just things happen, but part of it is we have had a particularly fraught media experience in that we have the contrast between the regulated broadcast media, which I think most people agree achieve a great amount, and on the other hand, we have extraordinarily ineffective ways of dealing with print media, and many other European countries, Norway, Republic of Ireland, but many others do better than the UK. Hence this immense inquiry, the Leveson inquiry, which looked into it. That's why I think it was really illuminating to see the detail of the sorts of things that happen when you have effectively, let us call it, a proprietor and editor regulated print media. And thank you for that, Steve. Laura, you were brave. You tried to go out there and say what we should do in, as an audience in democracy. And as I said to you in the interval, one of the things people have said about the predicament of the audience, of the democratic citizen in this case, is a classic comment: trouble with democracy, not enough evenings. So if you have to be a democratic citizen every evening, oh dear, it gets very complicated, because you have the shopping to do, you have the dinner to cook, you have the lecture to prepare, you have a whole lot of things to do, and somehow not enough evenings is a very apt comment. So I think the challenge you have given us, Laura, is what do we do when there aren't enough evenings? And of course,
Create more.
we can't really make more evenings, which would be so nice. But we have to think about cultural change in certain ways. I'll say very little about that this afternoon. Rowan, yes, human rights. How much are we going to stand with human rights here? I think myself, there's a history to be written, and you reminded me of this gap again, not explicitly, but it was there. Why do we talk since the mid-20th century predominantly about this very broad right, freedom of expression? It was not the traditional terminology, but it's there in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's also there in the European Convention. Why did it come in? My suspicion, and there's probably someone here who knows the answer, but I do hope you'll produce it. My suspicion is that it came in because we needed a new term. We had been, in most European languages, talking about freedom of speech and press freedom. There's also a very delightful German word, which some of you will know, Federfreiheit, which means the freedom of the pen, the freedom literally of the quill, or quite literally, the freedom of the feather. And when I read the first time the phrase freedom of the feather, I thought, what is that? But you see what it is. But you couldn't have gone on in the 20th century saying the freedom of broadcasting, the freedom of the internet, the freedom of this, the freedom of that. We needed a portmanteau term. But really the issue, as I see it, is not about the communications technologies that we have. They are really important, and they matter a lot. But the technologies are what they are, and I have to say, I think that the ethical considerations will apply whichever technology we're thinking of. I am at the moment, and I hope to hear more about this, much more interested in the intermediaries. That is to say, the route by which communication travels from the speaker to the ultimate audience, the writer to the ultimate audience, or we might say the inventor to the ultimate audience. I'm very fond of a story that Plato tells in his dialogue, the Phaedrus, where he is talking about why did Socrates refuse to write? And as we know, Socrates spoke, and then, very fortunately for us all, Plato wrote about it. So we do get to know about Socrates. But Socrates, as far as we know, didn't do writing. And he says, or rather Plato reports him as saying, that the danger of writing is that then your words go fatherless into the world with nobody to stand up and defend them or explain them or interpret them. I think it's a very profound thought that the directness of face-to-face communication is something very distinctive, and the question of the intermediaries is really important. Who are the intermediaries? And when we come to think about the contemporary world of mediated communication, what I'm hearing as important is not just the technologies, but also the route of travel of what you ultimately read or hear, or perhaps see the images you ultimately see. What's delivered to you might not be, except in remote ways, connected to other things. That, I believe, is what's making it so hard to judge. Now, Jonathan is playing a unique role here because he is bridging all these worlds from literature to self-regulation. He gave us a rather pessimistic message about changing culture, but I think that's a thought that is worth hanging on to, because again and again this morning we heard the thought that from, as it were, the proponents of the status quo with the British print media, that it would be censorship if to seek to change things. And you said that very clearly. I believe that that is a self-serving and implausible argument. The premises are implausible, the inferences are implausible, but we have to think, how can it be done? Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you all.
Well, thank you for your reflections on each and every one of the speakers. And now we open up for a little dialogue between, or many voices of the people on the podium. And then we'll open up for questions from the audience. But if there are anyone on the podium who would like to say anything or comment on what has been said?
Can I jump in? I mean, I suppose in a way, as Onora says, I was talking about the difficulties of turning theory into practice. And I guess one of the questions I had for the philosophers is the extent to which you're even interested in the theory being embodied in the real world. And say you are, and particularly Ray, you know, I was really inspired by your presentation. The thing about backdoor lies is actually really helpful with a very practical problem that we have regulating headlines. Because the headline writer or the person who's responsible for that headline will simply say, it's not untrue. Yeah. And I found it very hard to articulate why that's wrong. And you gave me a really useful new vocabulary. But the broader point you were making about the importance in a democracy of not lying, which I think is a really strong point, really valid. But I suppose I just wanted to push a little bit and to say, if the conclusion of that is that not only should the press and the news media have a duty to aspire towards truthfulness, but perhaps we should all have that duty, then where does lawmaking come in? I mean, so you could say, well, then there's a nice natural argument to say then we should have law which should enshrine that duty. Now, I would say that's probably not a good idea, because it puts far too much power in the hands of lawmakers to determine what is and is not true in a range of circumstances. But I suppose then the philosophical question is, well, when do you know, when does the cost of lawmaking in relation to speech and communications outweigh the benefits? So my critics would say that the Leveson framework for regulation, the cost there of involving the state in regulation outweighs the benefits. I say, no, it doesn't. The benefits outweigh the costs. You know, and we have a lovely argument that follows from that. But I think I can begin to kind of explain why I'm right and they're wrong. But I wonder, is there a general philosophical way of thinking through this problem of when would the cost of lawmaking outweigh the benefits?
So, I mean, that's a great question, and it, in some ways, is getting to the heart of the topic that Onora is going to be looking at this afternoon, because she's looking at the relationship of justice and ethics. And clearly, I mean, remember Mill talking about how the opinion that the corn dealer was starvers of the poor would be okay in one context and not in another. By the way, that one could be even true, the opinion that the corn dealer is the starvers of the poor. But in general, it would be it's one thing for, you know, a president to lie to a an inquiry, or a journalist who lie on a matter of national importance just before an election. The thought is these have got central, this context is one which is absolutely central to politics and to the ability of citizens to do their job as citizens. But then you're quite right that, you know, there's a sense in which if someone's lying about their friend or whatever, the law's not going to come in and say, clap you into jail for telling some explicit lie or a backdoor lie or whatever about you. You know, so what we need to think of are the principled reasons why certain forms of speech are absolutely integral to the function of communication as a political function, and how others, and this then raises some of the issues that Steve was raising, about whether it's legitimate to think that ordinary social relationships might be governed by similar norms, but the law shouldn't come in. So that doesn't mean anything you do in private is going to be okay, but it's a hard question, and so I look forward to hearing more from Onora about that.
I think, can I just, a related, slightly different point. It comes back to what Onora was raising about digital intermediaries, which I think is one of the great both empirical and philosophical challenges, which is what do you do with messages, communications, speech that is anonymized? I struggle to get my head around this, and I'd be interested in terms of the philosophical approach, because I'm not sure that it's something that we've ever faced before. You've got the kind of the verbal tradition of Socrates and the ancient world. The print tradition up until the 19th century was always, or mostly, it was identifiable, that speech was authored speech. Yeah. And even, there were various traditions in the 20th century around people who wrote under pen names, but most people knew who they were. Similarly, once we got into the broadcast era, you could see people. It was sort of, you know, Socrates made mass media. But now we're into an era where it is possible to see speech which has some kind of icon next to it, completely unidentifiable, which purports to be speaking truths. And we have no way of knowing either whether it is a verifiable truth or indeed what the provenance of that speech is. And I think that raises different and very difficult questions, both about philosophy and about law.
Rowan,
I wanted to say something that doesn't quite talk to what you just said, actually. It goes back to what Ray and Jonathan were saying, but maybe it's related. Which was just thinking about Jonathan's question about the cost of lawmaking and how we should think about when it's justified. Because I suppose one of the things I think we shouldn't think of lawmaking as doing is, in some sense, the law is an anonymous, to use your term, an anonymous description of the norms that would be best, and we bring in the law just to implement these. I think sometimes, at least among politicians, you find that view of, we've got to make a law, and here's what I want, to make a law for this. We have to think about the process of lawmaking. I think itself as a democratic process that's therefore not anonymized, but is us making these laws. And when you think about it like that, lawmaking is in some sense more and in some sense less of a solution. The less is the sense, it's not as if you can come up with your perfect description of the private-public distinction, the kind of thing Ray was trying to get at, and then have your laws that will implement that, and then just implement the laws, and that's it. It's got to be democratic. Sorry, so I suppose what I'm saying is there's a sort of interesting interplay between the norms we have at the moment and what actually lawmaking looks like and what its costs would be. If we were more democratic, lawmaking's costs and benefits would be different. We'd assess them differently. And that depends on having a different norm, a different sort of public norm of the public sphere, which itself depends on what laws are around.
Yeah, and I guess just adding a quick footnote, I guess, to what Rowan was saying. One question, I suppose, is also whether the law is always the best mechanism to affect change. And this goes back to something that Onora was also saying and to the topic of the later lecture today. So, I mean, political philosophers as well, such as myself, have had a tendency to sort of focus on the law, the coercive structure of the state, and seeing the action when it comes to achieving justice or democracy and so on as being all there. Somewhat forgetting the broader idea of an ethos or a societal ethos. And I guess some of the contributions today, including my own, were kind of pushing on placing some emphasis there. But one of the tricky questions is, you know, we kind of know more or less how law is made, but how exactly a social ethos is made, how you create that kind of thing, is a tough question to answer. I mean, I thought about possibly education as an avenue to get there. Public information campaigns, which are also sort of somewhat more top-down, but I see Onora shaking her head, so she is not convinced. And, well, you know, talking to each other as being another possibility. But it's really tough because you don't have kind of a structure that you can engineer. It's something that is meant to be bottom-up, and so it would have to be sort of individuals trying to themselves develop the relevant ethos, but it's a massive coordination problem. So I worry that sort of some lighter touch interventions, such as in education or, for instance, public information campaigns, might be necessary. But I'd be interested to hear what Onora has to say, because I saw her shake her head, so that suggests it wasn't right. Sorry, I should not have sort of pushed the ball back in your corner.
I agree with large parts of what you said.
But should we open up a few questions from the audience? Anybody who would like to pose a question or a comment or muse? Yes, Camilla, you'll get a microphone here. Could you introduce yourself first to the audience?
I will. My name is Camilla Sørkensen. I'm a professor of philosophy, also a Kant scholar. I'm the vice president of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. And I've also been on the Norwegian Press Complaint Commission for a number of years. So I found everything happening today extremely exciting from many points of view. So this is Camilla as the member of the Press Complaint Commission. I think in Norway it works pretty well. I think the codes of conduct that we have are much more like the broadcasting than what you have had for the press in the UK. But one thing that has been very challenging, I mean, our codes of our commission is mainly from the press, and then we're 3 people from the people, like professors of philosophy and things like that too. But what is the main challenge is partly what Ray talked about. It's not so much content as speech acts and problems with generics in titles and so on, but it's also this thing that it depends very much on the context in which the content and the speech act is presented. And in a way that's understandable, but very much of what is really disturbing to me, at least, is that nowadays a lot of things are sort of sold as being humor, satire, or so on, and then it seems that people expect that anything goes. So they say this is not supposed to be news, this is not supposed to be serious, so this is not hate speech, but because it's satire. And I think this is really, really challenging. And also, if it's part of opinion, you are more or less able to say just about whatever you want. So I wonder how you're facing that kind of challenge with the new norms in the UK.
Anybody feeling calling to respond to that?
Well, I have written on this a bit, and I have to say you put your finger, Camilla, on an absolutely difficult point, because, of course, when we talk about truth claims, we must be talking about speech acts that aim to make truth claims. But what we have and what we want and celebrate is a huge range of other speech acts, including speech acts that are merely expressive or speech acts that are perhaps mere fun. You know, nobody would be thinking that this applies to the crossword puzzle in the newspaper or that this applies to something else. But what I find interesting is that we do have in many countries an awareness that certain sorts of speech are particularly vulnerable to lying. And I think particularly about advertisement, so that for example, truth in advertising legislation is something that is actually quite strict in the UK. You make false claims about what you are selling, and you could be in real trouble. So we have thought sometimes about other sorts of speech act, and the law there is respected. I suppose I would want to say something about not putting a sharp dichotomy between legislation and culture change. And the press recognition panel about which Jonathan told us and which his organization as a press regulator has been accepted by, it is not a regulator, it is an auditor. Now, in the market societies, publicly listed companies, corporations, have to have their accounts professionally audited and have to publish the audited accounts. That is one way in which, in well-regulated societies, we keep companies straight. Now, it doesn't keep them totally straight. We know of cases where the audit has been perhaps dishonest. There were some rather famous cases within this century. But we have also cases where it works. It works as a routine matter, in fact. So I don't think being audited is an infraction of freedom.
Just, Camilla, I mean, just on the specifics, we spent the last year at Impress. One of the things we've been doing is developing our own standards code, which, I mean, Steve outlined some of the normative elements that you tend to find in press standards codes. And we looked at about 50 from around the world, including, I think, the Norwegian press code and many others. They're actually, anyone who's interested, they're all now very easily available on a particular website called, I think, the Accountability Journalism website, but they've translated all of them. It really makes good reading. So we tried to distill what we thought were the core elements, and then we consulted on those both with expert stakeholders and with the public more generally through qualitative and quantitative research, and came down to our set of 10 principles and rules. And one of our rules is simply, and I think this is maybe in the Norwegian code, that editors must distinguish clearly between comment and fact. And I would have liked to use the language of truth claim, but that was ruled out as being too philosophical through the consultation. But I think that's what we were trying to get at, was that, you know, it's like, I have to say there's still an ambiguity there, which I'm a bit unhappy about in our code. We say you must distinguish. We don't say absolutely clearly, and then what? You know, I think the assumption is that the code still applies to content which takes the form of comment. And I think you could understand satire to be a kind of comment. But I think we at least say trying to distinguish which is which, because otherwise you have dangerous wriggle room where an editor could say, oh, this front page story was actually an opinion piece, and conversely, a comment writer can smuggle false truth claims or backdoor lies into something which is overtly framed as a comment piece, and then say this is outside the parameter of the regulator. So I think the first step is to at least require a really explicit distinction between which is which. The second step is the harder one.
The problem, of course, with that is that it doesn't overcome the culturally specific issues of what kind of approach to truth-telling, or as I would put it in this case, journalism, is actually being encouraged or propagated within a particular organization. And certainly with the British press, and I thought, you know, the idea of backdoor lies is very resonant, because you can have many different kinds of front page stories which are colored in certain ways, driven by the agenda of that particular newspaper, which is clearly actually driven by an editorial approach, an opinionated approach, very often taking a very small fact and distorting it out of all proportion. The swans are a very good example. The Queen backs Brexit is another example, famous one from The Sun. And it is actually an opinion statement. It's a corporate opinion statement, but it is dressed up as a truth because it has an element of truth in it. Now, that is very different from, for example, the American print tradition, where there is still, you have journalism schools where people are taught to understand that you need two separate sources, facts need to be checked, but what you say in the opinion columns, where you actually commission people, sometimes to say deliberately provocative things, and the idea is that that's okay, raises a different question about what are the limits of, how do you define hate speech? What are the boundaries? What are the limits? But that's on the opinion side, where you have, I think you do have certain kind of boundaries of the law, where incitement to racial hatred becomes unacceptable by statute rather than by culture. But that kind of distinction between opinion and fact is very much blurred within the British press cultural tradition. Incidentally, I love the idea of a professor of philosophy being on the Press Complaints Commission. If that ever happened in the UK, that to me would be the turning point, the revelation.
Thank you. Did I see anybody from the press wanting to participate in this debate? Or not? No?
They're overregulated.
If not, I have the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences has wanted to pose a question.
Thank you so much. My name is Knut Helland, and it's been a pleasure to listen to you this morning. I find that very much has been, without the word actually being mentioned, very much has been focused on a public sphere understanding in this morning. A public sphere has its institutions. The question came up about the audience. What do we do to kind of make the audience interested in entering into this public sphere? I would raise the question, what do we do when we don't have an audience in a traditional sense? When they are elsewhere, not in the public sphere, not operating in the media for the public sphere. Thank you.
And where, just so I'm clear, where are they? Where would the audience? Where?
On their iPad.
There are in echo chambers and other places where the traditional public sphere is not working.
Yeah.
Anybody wants to? Onora?
In this very recent book by Cass Sunstein called #Republic, and he says that when he started working on this topic, he was quite, in a way, mesmerized by it and appalled, and he thought, well, if we get a new non-public sphere in which people, as it were, filter what they hear about other things by liking it, then it will end up with somebody only encountering the views that they already share, and their circle already shares. And in fact, we'd have the Daily Me. And then he explored a bit further, and he found the Daily Me already exists. So I have to ask the question, what would we have to do to inject a certain breadth of exposure and experience into our lives when the new way of receiving material tends to lead to at least some people finding themselves in silos. It isn't obvious because it seems as though all the world is flooding in from our screens. But if it is filtered, of course, it isn't all the world. And so we have enormous work by the psychologists showing that we much prefer to hear the views of people who agree with us. And that's what we've got to deal with, so that people think it is a privilege and an interest to encounter Laura's taxi driver, who probably, though we don't know, doesn't agree with her politically. But how to do that's very hard. People imagine they are getting huge diversity, but then the moment when they say, but everybody thinks this, is the moment we need to pay attention. I agree, it is the destruction of a shared public sphere.
Yes?
Just an extra thought that struck me on this was that we have to be very careful not to slip into the position of presupposing that some people aren't going to be our audience. In the sense that I think to get the right attitude to participation in the public sphere, you have to assume there's an audience, you have to assume that anyone could be a potential interlocutor of yours. And I think there's always a risk when you start thinking, well, these people are off in silos. You don't just think that, you start thinking of them as these people, these people who are distant, who I can't get at. And I think there's something funny going on, but I think one has to presuppose that anyone will listen to reason anywhere and be willing to engage on it. And how you square that with the fact that in some sense that's obviously not true is, I think, really hard.
Well, I think the empirical evidence is that it is less true. And a book I very much like among recent books is Gillian Tett's The Silo Effect. It's not true because our institutions are much more constructed to encapsulate people so that in your working life you will not, as it were, encounter perhaps random other people. The nice evidence she produces is that those institutions that have been most successful for reasons of corporate security very often in constructing silos have suffered because they did it.
I think it's interesting, isn't it, that these metaphors like silos they're very helpful at capturing a particular issue, and they help us to conceptualize that and think about it, but they also can lock us into a particular vision. And the truth is, when I hear about people living in echo chambers and living in silos, I tend to really imagine someone living in a locked apartment with a screen like this.
What is a silo?
Sorry. Well, I think a silo is some farmers store grain in
a silo is an agricultural building for containing the grain.
That's so weird to imagine people in these. Anyway,
now as the discussion starts to sort of float out, I am sorry that I'll have to cut it off at this point. We have a program to follow. I just let Onora perhaps get the last word and just say a few things before we have lunch.
Let me just say what I shall try to do in this lecture after lunch. I won't be talking about ethics for, of, by, or with communication. Well, maybe by communication. I will be trying to talk about the wider philosophical background, which I think, among other things, would be useful in thinking about ethics for communication, although I won't specifically illustrate it with points about communication. So I worried a bit about this, but I think there is some continuity between the themes of this morning and the topic for this afternoon, but it is a matter of broadening rather than further deepening our discussion of contemporary media and intermediaries. Thank you very much.
On that note, I want to thank all of the speakers and for Onora for her reflective remarks as part of this morning. I hope that you will all come back at 2 o'clock for the Holberg lecture. In the meantime, we serve free lunch. This is not something that happens very often, so you should profit from it. And we will see you back here at 2. Well, thank you very much. The audience, the speakers.